what is the true story of Ferdinand Magellan? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive, and every video immerses you in the destinies of those who shaped the world. Today, prepare to cross the veil of time and embark on the waves of an odyssey as crazy as it is historic. In the heart of the 16th century, amid storms, mutinies, and unknown lands, rises the name of a navigator ready to defy the impossible, Ferdinand Magellan. Between glory and shipwrecks, ambition and sacrifice, Magellan opens a path that no one had dared to imagine. For 5 centuries, his name has resounded as that of a man who dared to bend the planet to his will. What does the myth of Magellan really reveal? And at what price does one become the first to sail around the world? But before setting off on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to miss nothing. Thank you and have a nice trip. Around 1480, the world already presented itself as a vast network of exchanges, connecting very distant lands to one another. At that time, Europe was not isolated, nor were Asia or Africa. Merchant communities and diplomatic emissaries had been circulating for centuries, trading silk, spices, gold, and many other coveted products. Peoples observed each other, inspired one another, sometimes clashed, but remained in constant interaction. This period was also marked by the expansion of great empires. In Asia, the Ming power asserted its authority over China while maintaining an active maritime trade network. Caravans traveling from Beijing to Samarkand or Baghdad proved the commercial vitality of the Far East. On the other side, the Middle East and North Africa were under the growing influence of Muslim dynasties, while the routes between continents were bustling in a continuous fervor. In this context, the Ottoman Empire occupied a central position, extending from Anatolia to the edges of Eastern Europe and dominating the Eastern Mediterranean basin. Under the dynasty of the Sultans, the economy developed around land and maritime exchanges, linking Genoa, Venice, and Levantine ports. Still in this world of 1480, Persia saw the rise of the Safavid dynasty, whose Shia religious fervor shaped political and cultural identity. In West Africa, the powerful Songhai kingdom controlled the Niger River loop, perpetuating the legacy of the Mali Empire and establishing itself as a center for trans-Saharan trade of salt, gold, and products from sub-Saharan Africa. Caravans abounded in Timbuktu, a true intellectual and mercantile crossroads where scholars and merchants converged to exchange knowledge and precious commodities. The city also shone culturally, with libraries and Islamic universities. On the other side of the Atlantic, America also knew powerful political formations, although the inhabitants of the Old World were unaware of the extent of these civilizations. In the Mesoamerican region, the Aztec Empire was in full expansion, structured around Tenochtitlan, a city erected on a lake and endowed with majestic temples. The Aztecs cultivated corn, beans, and peppers while levying tributes on vast conquered territories. Further south, in the Andean highlands, the Inca Empire gradually unified peoples from its center in Cusco. Its vast network of roads, the Inca Trail, connected mountain villages and facilitated the movement of goods like potatoes, quinoa, and all sorts of regional resources. Behind these imperial constructions stretched a world of cities, chiefdoms, and prosperous kingdoms. Each region evolved with its customs and politics. In Europe, multiple territories coexisted under distinct sovereignties. France, England, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, or the Italian states did not yet constitute modern unified nations. Feudal or dynastic alliances often dictated the political organization. Despite these divisions, the continent experienced an artistic and intellectual flourishing spurred by the Renaissance, favored by Italian patrons and the rise of universities. Cultivated elites rediscovered the heritage of Greco-Roman antiquity, while merchants crisscrossed the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Merchant cities like Venice or Genoa thrived thanks to their strategic position between Europe and the East. The great Champagne fairs and other trading hubs stimulated the circulation of goods and ideas. In the north, the cities of the Hanseatic League absorbed the commercial flows of the Baltic and the North Sea. The entire region remained fragmented. For centuries, the Afro-Eurasian trade routes have facilitated the circulation of exotic goods, reflecting a partially globalized world. Chinese silks cross the Central Asian mountain ranges and then reach the markets of the Near East and Mediterranean Europe. Spices from the islands of Southeast Asia, such as pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, cross the Indian Ocean to arrive in the souks of Cairo or Aleppo, before being resold to Venetian and Genoese merchants. Gold, extracted from mines in West Africa, moves north via caravans to supply the mints of the old continent. African slaves, for their part, travel along the same routes, sold in the Levant, or to powerful landowners in certain Mediterranean regions. These exchanges take place under the auspices of predominantly Muslim and Italian intermediaries, who master the language, navigation, and negotiation. Alongside these flows of goods, knowledge travels as well. Europe, at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, inherits the Ptolemaic geography, which structures the way of representing the world. Greek manuscripts, enriched by Arabic translations, circulate via Spain or Italy. Muslim astronomers and cartographers, such as Al-Idrisi or Ibn Battuta, have already developed significant knowledge about the position of stars or the measurement of distances. Their legacy, integrated by European scholars, contributes to shaping a more precise vision of the Earth. In Portugal, navigators strive to revise this data based on their own explorations along the African coasts. The first portolans, marine charts detailing ports and shores, begin to circulate, offering a new perspective on the maritime expanses. These innovations fuel curiosity for the distant unknown. Beyond cartography, the late 15th century sees the emergence or improvement of various navigation instruments. The astrolabe, inherited from the Arab world and refined by European craftsmen, allows the measurement of the height of stars to determine latitude at sea. Navigators who once cautiously followed the coasts can now venture further into the ocean, relying on relatively reliable celestial calculations. The portolan, on the other hand, presents itself as a detailed coastal map, compiling information on prevailing winds, reefs, harbors, and capes. Finally, the caravel, a ship of Portuguese design, proves to be particularly maneuverable and fast, thanks to a mixed sail plan consisting of both lateen and square sails and a shallow draft. This naval innovation enables long ocean crossings and promotes the advancement of maritime expeditions. At the dawn of new discoveries, the impossible seems conceivable. In the Indian Ocean, trade networks form an exchange basin as dynamic as the Mediterranean. Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants regularly ply these seas, transporting textiles, spices, gems, and luxury goods between the ports of East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Southeast Asia. Mariners from the region have long mastered lateen sail navigation, adapted to monsoon winds and seasonal currents. Cities like Calicut in India or Malacca on the Malay Peninsula serve as hubs where goods from China, Indonesia, Arabia, and Egypt converge. Sometimes these cargoes then take the overland route to the Mediterranean via the Red Sea. At this time, controlling strategic straits, such as Hormuz or Bab el-Mandeb, proves crucial for regulating trade flow and maintaining regional balance. free themselves from dependence on Muslim and Italian intermediaries, some European kingdoms consider finding their own maritime routes to the lands of abundance. Spices remain one of the primary drivers of this quest, as they not only enhance the taste of food, but also preserve meats and fish. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg sell for such high prices in Europe that controlling them ensures immense profits. Venetian merchants, firmly established in the Levant, have long dominated this trade. However, competition from Genoa, the rising Ottoman power, and the desire to minimize transportation costs prompt Atlantic powers to explore new routes. Portugal thus takes the lead, determined to circumvent Africa to directly access Asian markets. Exploratory voyages confirm this ambition. The technological rise accompanies these aspirations. Astronomical knowledge, once scattered, is compiled in new treatises. Navigators from the Iberian Peninsula resort to increasingly precise tools to read the sky. Improved astronomical tables, recalibrated compasses, and perfected astrolabes. The shipyards, on the other hand, strive to build ships capable of withstanding the rigors of the Atlantic. With their solid flanks and sturdy masts, caravels and naos prepare to face longer distances. Meanwhile, cartographers relentlessly refine their representation of the world, integrating the accounts of sailors recently returned from African expeditions. Gradually, the idea of directly reaching the Spice Islands or discovering new lands fuels the collective imagination. Monarchs support or finance these efforts, hoping to compete with established commercial powers. Fierce rivalries soon ensue. At the turn of the 15th century, the Iberian kingdoms, namely Portugal and Castile, find themselves at the forefront of maritime exploration. Portugal, under the impetus of multiple monarchs, has already undertaken expeditions along the African coasts well before the year 1494. Portuguese navigators first dreaded crossing Cape Bojador, located on the northwest coast of Africa. For a long time, this area was considered an insurmountable limit, as legends reported waters infested with monsters. Yet, gradually, Portuguese caravels pushed back these maritime boundaries, encouraging other explorers to venture even further. The decisive crossing of Cape Bojador paves the way for an even more ambitious quest, to reach the southern tip of Africa and discover a sea route to the wealthy lands of Asia. Bartolomeu Dias, in 1488, becomes the first European to cross the Cape of Good Hope, long dubbed the Cape of Storms for its formidable weather conditions. Thanks to his determination and the experience accumulated by generations of sailors, Dias proves that a passage exists. This accomplishment amplifies Portuguese enthusiasm for exploration and prompts the court to invest further in future expeditions, notably those to be led by Vasco da Gama. In 1498, Vasco da Gama materializes the idea of chaining Europe directly to India by sea. By reaching the coast of Calicut, on the southwestern coast of India, he confirms the promise of immense profits based on the sale of spices, silks, and other luxury items. His ships laden with precious goods bring back to Lisbon a spectacular gain that fuels the enthusiasm of the nobility and King Manuel III. For Portugal, this new commercial link offers hope of freeing itself from Muslim and Italian intermediaries. The emerging monopoly strengthens Portuguese prestige and stirs the covetousness of its Iberian neighbors. Opposite, Castile does not remain idle. Since 1492, the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, have supported Christopher Columbus's project. Departing with 3 caravels, Columbus thought he had reached the East Indies by sailing west. In reality, he landed in the Caribbean islands, which he named Hispaniola, or San Salvador depending on the exact location, believing they were Asian lands. This event, termed the discovery of the New World, generates enthusiasm in Castile. However, it also provokes intense rivalries with Portugal, which considers these areas as potentially attached to its maritime domain. To resolve this emerging conflict, the Iberian monarchs request the arbitration of Pope Alexander VI of Spanish origin. In 1493, he issues several papal bulls, drawing a first demarcation line. This grants the Castilians the right to explore and conquer the lands discovered west of a given meridian, while the Portuguese retain their holdings to the east. However, this initial distribution does not satisfy Portugal, which believes the line is too close to its Atlantic coasts. Moreover, the stakes of sovereignty are immense, as it involves controlling yet unknown territories with potentially considerable wealth. In 1494, negotiations began that led to the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Representatives of Castile and Portugal agreed to move the line of demarcation further west, offering Portugal a greater margin in the Atlantic. This agreement, validated by a subsequent papal bull, redefined influence zones in a global perspective. At that time, many still ignored the true extent of the New World, and no one suspected the existence of an ocean beyond the American continent. Yet, the line drawn on the maps would determine for centuries the colonial footprint of the two Iberian powers. The immediate consequences of this treaty are multiple. On one hand, Portugal obtained the possibility of claiming the future Brazil, discovered by chance a few years later during Pedro Álvares Cabral's expedition in 1500. On the other hand, Castile was free to push its explorations westward while planning potential voyages to the south of the American continent. The treaty granted religious and political legitimacy to the conquest of territories little or not known by Europeans. Each crown considered itself invested with an evangelizing and commercial mission, justifying the establishment of forts and enclaves on newly claimed and administered lands. However, this formal division of the world on paper did not yet reflect geographic realities, nor the exact understanding of distances. The maps of the time were based on Ptolemaic geography and sometimes approximate estimates of the Earth's circumference. Although the treaty seemed to allocate everything to two powers, other European kingdoms like England or France were already taking an interest in the Atlantic. The privateers and navigators of these countries would soon challenge the Iberian monopoly as they modernized their fleets and sought new routes. For now, maritime hegemony remained Iberian without real competition. The greater question, however, remained the search for spices. At the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, the thirst for pepper, cinnamon, and cloves motivated a large number of naval ventures. For Europe, these exotic products were worth much more than their weight in gold, and the Iberian powers sought to reduce their dependency on Eastern merchants. Portugal definitely hoped to bypass trade networks controlled by Muslim sultanates and Italian cities like Venice or Genoa. The goal was to ensure direct supply from Asia without having to pay heavy transit fees or rely on third parties. For its part, Castile saw in the lands discovered by Columbus a hope of finding new wealth, especially in precious metals. The desire for gold and silver was no less strong than that for spices. Assuming the islands and explored continents could hold abundant mines, the Castilian court bet on opening innovative trade routes. Some advisors still believed it possible that Asia lay not far from the Caribbean, which would encourage the search for a western maritime passage to spices. Thus, the prospect of quick gains fueled a climate of excitement and uncertainty for each exploration. competition between Portugal and Castile is therefore fueled by the need to assert their supremacy on the high seas and to control access to the most lucrative resources. Each of these powers financed successive expeditions, some exploring the Atlantic, others seeking to establish themselves in the Indian Ocean. Future suspicions of territorial overlap prompted both crowns to consolidate their rights through this papal treaty, while hoping to circumvent mutual competition. For kingdoms that had just come out of dynastic wars or the Reconquista, it was also a matter of national prestige and religious and cultural influence. In practice, the Tordesillas line traverses the Atlantic from pole to pole, meant to separate the Portuguese hemisphere from the Castilian hemisphere. Yet, the navigators of the time were unaware of the precise existence of the Brazilian coast and the real dimensions of the Pacific. When a Portuguese or Castilian vessel sailed along discovered shores, the question remained, are we east or west of this invisible line? Ambiguities were common, and each side sought to interpret the treaty to its advantage. The sovereigns themselves, ill-informed, relied on cosmographers to draft new maps. Rivalries intensified as official maritime reports accumulated. At the same time, the competition for spices is intensifying. Despite the route opened by Vasco da Gama to the Indian Ocean, Portugal quickly understands that simply sailing along Africa is not enough to dominate this trade. The powerful Muslim states in the region, like the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt or the Sultanate of Gujarat, still control many ports. The Portuguese ships must fight to establish treaties with local authorities or seize strategic points like Goa, on the west coast of India. The idea is to create a fortified network to secure the supply of spices and quickly outpace Castile. As for Castile, it seeks a route to these same spices via the west, believing it would be shorter to cross the Atlantic Ocean rather than circumnavigate Africa. The support given to Columbus, and later to other navigators, is explained by the ambition to discover a passage leading directly to the coveted islands. The possibility of circumventing the American lands, still poorly delineated, fascinates cartographers and sovereigns. The Aragonese and the Castilians, united under the Habsburgs, begin to consider that this new world is merely an obstacle on the route to the spices, which stirs covetousness and hopes. In this context, the idea of finding another route to the Moluccas, renowned for their clove and nutmeg plantations, becomes an obsession. The Portuguese believe that navigation via the east remains their stronghold, while Castile must explore the western route to demonstrate the validity of its claims. The eagerness of each crown is reinforced by the promise of colossal gains in European markets, where the price of spices continues to rise. Each wants to secure the favor of the Pope, the support of Genoese or Flemish bankers, as well as a decisive position in global trade. Fernão de Magalhães is born around the year 1480 in a rural region of northern Portugal that extends not far from the Douro River. Official sources sometimes diverge as to his exact place of birth, but it is often accepted that he comes from a small seigneurial community under the authority of noble families owning agricultural lands and feudal rights. His parents, members of a lineage then still little known, enjoy some local recognition and are considered gentlemen belonging to the minor nobility. However, this distinction remains quite relative in a Portugal where the social hierarchy is strictly established and where fortune is truly only passed on within great houses of higher rank. Thus, despite his prestigious surname, young Fernão does not grow up in opulence. He does not have access to the same privileges as the heirs of powerful duchies, but he nonetheless benefits from the basic education that a modest noble family eager to impart a sense of honor and loyalty to the crown can claim. His childhood unfolds in a context of multiple changes, as Portugal, already turned toward the Atlantic, increasingly displays its maritime ambition. At this time, the Portuguese sovereign John II, in Portuguese João II, who ascended the throne in 1481, continues the expansion policy initiated by his predecessors. He strives to consolidate royal authority, reduce the influence of some great nobles, and support explorations along the African coast. The Portuguese navigators are then seeking routes leading to the riches of the East Indies, reputed to hold spices, precious stones, and silks sought after throughout Europe. In this climate, where navigation and cartography become major stakes, the Portuguese nobility prides itself on sending its sons on exploration or conquest missions. For a young man born into a good family, the sea represents both a horizon of promises and a military vocation valued by the court. From a very young age, Fernão witnesses the thrilling and sometimes exaggerated tales reported by those returning from West Africa, or the more distant regions already known as Guinea. He quickly develops a curiosity for these unknown worlds and a great desire to distinguish himself elsewhere than in the rolling lands of his childhood. Before even reaching his adolescence, he is sent to the king's court to perfect his training. Fernão's parents, aware of the importance of a rigorous education, believe that proximity to the sovereign is the best way to deepen his knowledge. Noble children arriving in the royal entourage are placed under the tutelage of tutors who teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also etiquette, the art of chivalry, and the rudiments of military strategy. The Portuguese, eager to maintain their maritime advantage, are giving increasing importance to scientific subjects. Disciplines related to astronomy, geography, and cosmography become indispensable for anyone aspiring to command a ship or hold an officer's rank in the royal fleets. Thus, young Fernão discovers early on the importance of understanding the movement of the stars to navigate on the high seas, mastering the techniques for calculating latitude or longitude, then in full expansion, and consulting navigational charts that are continually corrected as the knowledge of the globe improves. When he joins the entourage of King John II, the intellectual climate is particularly stimulating. The monarch, sometimes nicknamed the Perfect Prince, is interested in cartography and encourages the meticulous compilation of information reported by navigators. Arab and Jewish cosmographers settled in Portugal contribute to the work undertaken in royal circles, allowing the court to understand astronomical tables and perfect the use of the astrolabe. Fernão, through the lessons he receives, apprehends the logic behind these measuring instruments intended to interpret the celestial vault. He learns to handle the quadrant and make the first tracings of a portolan, those essential marine charts for pilots who must avoid sandbanks, dangerous reefs, and poorly identified capes. At the same time, the study of mathematics, still in its infancy in European circles, enriches itself with encounters with Eastern knowledge. Arabic numerals gradually compete with Roman numerals, and trigonometry offers new perspectives for calculating distances at sea or drawing plans of coastal fortifications. For Fernão, a fascinating universe unfolds, blending theories and tales of sailors, sometimes bordering on exploits, sometimes on legends. In 1495, John II dies without leaving a direct heir, thus paving the way for Manuel I, the cousin of the deceased king, who then ascends to the throne. This succession does not immediately affect Fernão's training. The new king, often called the Fortunate, wants to continue the expansionist momentum of his predecessors. While Manuel I aims to assert himself through acts of prestige and glory, the court is more focused than ever on the preparation of naval expeditions. Ambitions related to the maritime route to India are growing, and the rise of a few navigators, such as Bartolomeu Dias or Vasco da Gama, confirms Portugal's desire to bypass the Venetian and Arab commercial monopoly by finding a direct route to the riches of the Grand Indian Ocean. Some young nobles, less fortunate but determined, see it as an opportunity to prove their worth in combat and earn new income from the trade of spices and exotic materials. For Fernão, this grand prospect fuels his dreams of a maritime career and advocates for even more solid training. At Manuel Thrush's court, the atmosphere is brilliant, animated by the courtly intrigues typical of such an entourage. Influential personalities vie for the king's attention, who can grant pensions, commands, or titles to those who prove loyal and useful to the monarchy. Factions form around close advisors, and young nobles, if they manage to stand out, can hope to climb the ranks. However, in a system where privileges are often transmitted through inheritance, those who do not have significant possessions or powerful family networks risk remaining in the shadows. Fernão already senses that he does not come from a wealthy enough lineage to shine solely by his renown. Despite everything, he clings to his passion for navigation and naval art, believing that his scientific knowledge and determination can compensate for his lack of wealth. The young man dedicates himself to the study of military tactics and discovers the essential elements of a war conducted at sea or from coastal fortresses. The defense of trading posts, the protection of merchant ships, and the projection of maritime power are part of the curriculum. Fernão meets older officers who have participated in naval battles near the African coast or fought pirates in the Atlantic. He listens to descriptions of the ideal position to adopt for bombarding an enemy port, techniques for assembling or repairing a damaged ship, and the fastest way to load cannons and culverins. At this time of military transformation, the bronze cannon is becoming widespread, and the Portuguese army continuously improves its mastery of amphibious attacks. Little by little, Fernão develops a methodical mind where the spirit of exploration, scientific rigor, and the desire to triumph in combat against potential enemies of the kingdom combine. However, daily life at court is not free from frustrations. The places of honor within the royal household are scarce, and the expenses to maintain a young noble rise quickly. Even if he is fortunate to live in the monarch's circle, Fernão does not occupy a comfortable position. He must maintain his prestigious clothing, offer a few gifts at ceremonies, and uphold his rank despite a modest income. This delicate financial situation frustrates him. He does not possess the necessary capital to enter the businesses forming around maritime trade, nor does he have a territory to firmly establish his status. He feels relegated to the background, behind more powerful nobles. The typical pride of a gentleman fosters a kind of incomprehension in him. How does one distinguish oneself when one must constantly prove one's worth to claim even the smallest command? Young Fernão cultivates the hope that a long expedition might change everything. Many of his fellow lesser nobles share the same aspiration, to head towards East Africa, reach the Indian Ocean, cover themselves in glory and perhaps wealth. Experience shows that many officers returning from these campaigns have been conferred honorary titles or positions that ensure a decent income. Others, having invested their own money, buy exquisite merchandise at the gates of India to sell in Europe at exorbitant prices, sometimes becoming wealthy in just one voyage. The stories of those who return from Sofala, Mombasa, or Calicut fuel the collective imagination. Yet, departures to these distant lands are not always immediate. Royal authorization, mandates, and, most importantly, convincing high-ranking officers that one is reliable enough to hold a command position are required. At this stage of his life, Fernão is still too young and too poorly established to be entrusted with a significant mission. But this waiting period allows him to strengthen his strategic knowledge and maintain his network of contacts within the royal circle, a crucial condition for applying for an expedition. Meanwhile, tensions already exist between Castile and Portugal, born from the desire to dominate the new maritime routes and impose themselves in international trade. Although Fernão has no reasons yet to serve the Castilian crown, he realizes that the Iberian competition is at the heart of political discussions. At the court of Manuel Fers, Portuguese successes are proudly touted, like the route of the Cape of Good Hope, opened by Bartolomeu Dias in 1488, or Vasco da Gama's journey to Calicut in 1497. However, it is not ignored that Christopher Columbus, in the service of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, also triggered a great transformation by reaching, at the same time, unknown territories to the west. The young Magellan, eager to understand the world, certainly observes with curiosity how naval questions and diplomatic rivalries intertwine. If he wants to prosper, any old conflict or new treaty can have direct consequences on his future as a navigator. In 1500, Manuel III further intensified the efforts of exploration and expansion. The monarch sent large fleets into the Indian Ocean to consolidate his presence in strategic Asian port cities, hoping for a monopoly on the spice trade. Amid this whirlwind of enterprises, Fernão, slightly older than when he first arrived at court, hopes to secure a concrete engagement. He feels that such a mission would be the ideal path to establish his name and build a reputation. He has studied, honed his technique, observed port maneuvers when caravels loaded with precious goods arrived. He has attended meticulous inspections of ships in the royal fleet and memorized the location of every sail, every piece of artillery, every hold reserved for storing provisions. He also knows that the balance between firepower and maneuverability of a vessel can decide victory in case of a confrontation at sea. Yet, he still feels the impatience of a young wolf wanting his time to come, to be allowed to prove what he is capable of. But the advent of his first opportunities in the Portuguese Navy depends entirely on the goodwill of his superiors, who must be convinced of his merit and usefulness. In the early years of the 16th century, some recently promoted courtly nobles began spreading rumors that Fernão was too proud or too thirsty for glory. Others accused him, in half words, of aiming for responsibilities for which he had not yet proven himself. This atmosphere of rivalries weighs on him, aware that he is neither the wealthiest nor the best supported. He seeks to demonstrate that knowledge and experience can supplement an unwealthy lineage. He participates in academic meetings, exchanges with professors of cartography, is interested in instruments facilitating night navigation, and immerses himself in the Lusitanian tradition of discovery. Unlike some young nobles who rest on their titles, Fernão feels he must acquire more than just status to aim for an exceptional destiny. Around 1504-1505, the long-awaited opportunity to embark for the Orient finally begins to materialize. It isn't yet a prestigious command, but rather a subordinate officer position within a fleet destined for the Indian Ocean. Military officials start to notice his skills, praise his knowledge of the winds, astral navigation, tide calculations, and his ability to remain disciplined within a hierarchical environment. His determined temperament is also noted, sometimes deemed too abrupt, but useful in the heat of action. For Fernão, it is vital to finally break free from the routine of the court and dive into the heart of maritime adventure. He no longer has the patience to serve a monarch who, although aware of his presence, hardly rewards it. At little more than 20 years old, with noble blood but no great fortune, and a solid education in astronomy and mathematics, all this must now blend into the pragmatic reality of naval expeditions. The very idea of leaving so far excites in him a mix of enthusiasm and nervousness. Although the first exchanges of goods between Lisbon and the Indian Ocean have been established, many areas remain unknown, and potential conflicts with other powers are not insignificant. Portuguese navigators are not always welcomed as liberators, and it is necessary to prepare to face local rulers more or less willing to let Europeans set up trading posts in their ports. No matter what, Fernão understands that the court of Portugal will offer him no more than an intermediate position, at least for the time being. But it doesn't matter. He feels ready to face the unknown, and above all, to stand out in the field. In his mind, military glory and royal recognition go through these journeys to the ends of the earth. Only total engagement in the Indian Ocean campaign and good relations with his future superiors will allow him to forge the reputation he covets. Thus begins the trajectory of a man who, having started from a small provincial nobility, hopes one day to inscribe his name in the pantheon of the great explorers of Portugal. In the early 16th century, Portugal, emboldened by its African explorations and its trading posts in Asia, embarked on military and commercial expansion campaigns in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese navigators, trained in advanced cartography and navigation techniques, leveraged their experiences to establish solid bases on sea routes already used by Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants. In this context, Fernão de Magalhães, a young officer, acquired skills and character during the Escola do Oriente, a set of campaigns conducted between 1505 and 1513. Rivalries were intense because Portugal sought to establish itself against Muslim powers established in the region. Its technological superiority in naval artillery and the ambitions of King Manuel III propelled Lisbon to the rank of a formidable power. It was in this atmosphere that Magellan made his debut. The arrival of the Portuguese on the Swahili coast and then in India reflects a quest to control trade flows. Since 1505, governors like Francisco de Almeida set up fortresses and trading posts to secure the transport of spices, precious stones, and textiles. Mastery of open sea navigation was consolidated through the systematic exploitation of trade winds and currents. Maneuverable ships, such as caravels, offered the Portuguese formidable projection power. Magellan, assigned to experienced officers, observed these advancements and trained in naval science. He also discovered the logic of local alliances, essential to sideline other intermediaries. The rapidity of Portuguese ships and their superior artillery frequently overcame the coastal sultanate's defenses. The experience accumulated since the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 remained crucial. The storms of the South Atlantic and the uncertain currents along African coasts posed challenges, yet Portugal gradually asserted itself in the Indian Ocean. The naval forces conducted not only commercial operations, but also regularly combated local fleets, which were less equipped with modern artillery. Magellan gained his first battle experiences from this and earned the trust of his superiors, bolstering his personal ambitions. The victorious battles solidified the nascent empire of Manuel III. The Portuguese officer understood that only perseverance would allow him to advance socially. His comrades already described him as a disciplined, calculating sailor, willing to invest himself fully. In 1510, Portugal seized Goa on India's west coast, making it the center of its Asian empire. Afonso de Albuquerque, the new governor, gave positions of trust to officers who had proven their tactical abilities. Magellan held a role in naval artillery and participated in coordinating deployed troops. Accounts mention his logistical realism and diplomatic caution, sometimes seeking negotiations with the local elite before resorting to force. From then on, Goa became a strategic base for the Portuguese fleet, linking the Indian Ocean to future expansions in Asia. This success bolstered Magellan's prestige, earning him more delicate roles in military administration. Albuquerque then turned his sights to Malacca, an important commercial hub in Southeast Asia. In 1511, the Portuguese assault targeted this city where Chinese, Javanese, Arab, and Indian goods transited. Magellan's precise role is poorly documented, with chronicles focusing on Albuquerque. Nevertheless, it is established that he participated in the maneuvers, applying his knowledge of tropical navigation and artillery. The capture of Malacca gave Portugal effective control over the passage, linking the Indian Ocean to the far eastern seas. The establishment of a fortified warehouse in the city opened the path to the Spice Islands for the kingdom of Manuel Fer. Magellan's notoriety increased, although he remained in the shadow of his governor. During these campaigns, the study of monsoons and seasonal winds becomes essential. Portuguese sailors adapt to changes in direction and the strength of the rains, relying on Arabic and Indian accounts. Magellan, curious about cartography, meticulously notes each route and takes an interest in the establishment of trade networks. He seeks to understand the economic functioning of trading posts and how to introduce Portuguese influence there. His superiors appreciate him for his diligence and ability to gather reliable information. Gradually, Magellan becomes more involved with supply circuits and forges useful contacts to acquire, transport, and resell spices. This enthusiasm attracts both admirers and potential enemies. Over the course of battles, Magellan suffers various injuries, sometimes in harsh clashes against local coalitions supported by rival merchants. Wherever the Portuguese settle, they incite fear and revolt, as their commercial monopoly impacts regional economies. Yet Magellan's heroism during these engagements earns him certain favor with Albuquerque. He receives honors and rewards, even though his social status remains modest. This recognition encourages rival officers to harbor suspicions about his parallel enrichments. The more prestige Magellan acquires, the more vulnerable he becomes to intrigues at the court of Goa. The Portuguese administration remains both proud of his successes and vigilant regarding potential deviations by its agents. The limits of private trade for officers become blurred. Many purchase loads of spices, silks, or precious stones. Officially, these operations must adhere to the rules imposed by the Crown to regulate profits and prevent abuses. In practice, illicit transactions are common. Magellan, confident in his talent and bolstered by his service record, likely participates in these exchanges to supplement his income. Jealousies within the Portuguese hierarchy then crystallize around him. Some reproach him for acting without official consent, while others denounce his ability to connect directly with local merchants. Thus, the first accusations of malfeasance arise. Around 1512, serious suspicions weigh on Magellan. Reports accuse him of having concluded lucrative deals without the support of superior officers. He allegedly secretly acquired a batch of spices and valuable items shipped to Goa to be resold in Portugal. As many act in the same manner, it's challenging to establish the truth of these claims. However, Magellan, already in the spotlight, becomes the preferred target of those determined to harm his reputation. Intrigues intensify, undermining the image of the young officer. In an emerging empire where no strict protocol is yet established, such accusations suffice to sow distrust, even among longtime friends. Afonso de Albuquerque's administration, seeking to consolidate its authority, monitors these deviations with concern. The governor knows that Portuguese legitimacy relies on certain rigor in the distribution of loot and tax collection. For his part, Magellan considers himself a victim of unjust denunciations. He explains that, on the ground, barter and spice acquisition constitute a form of supplementary pay, implicitly tolerated. Yet, the political instability worsens amidst personal rivalries, clan maneuvers, and the need for unity against external enemies, making the situation burdensome. Magellan feels his privileged position waver. Even his supporters cannot guarantee that the suspicions won't lead to a permanent disgrace. Despite this, a few officers continue to praise Magellan's effectiveness, both militarily and logistically. His in-depth knowledge of routes and Eastern cultures fascinates several officers, aware that the longevity of the Portuguese Empire depends on accurate maps and an adapted diplomacy. He thus remains protected, although tensions rise. Within the court of Manuel Thursch, the power struggle between supporters of brutal expansion and those preferring to establish trade agreements fuels mutual suspicions. Magellan, having actively worked in invasions, does not escape criticism from those who consider him too audacious, even solely interested in his own profit. Official conclusions are lacking, but tensions persist. Divergent opinions on the conduct to adopt in the Indian Ocean reverberate all the way to Lisbon, where the Crown attempts to keep each actor under control. Magellan, however, senses that his future in Portugal is darkening. He has served on various fronts, accumulated wounds and praises, but he is hitting the limits of a system dominated by a few suspicious elites. The School of the Orient, over the course of these 8 years, has certainly granted him extensive marine and military experience, but also a brutal confrontation with political machinery. As he prepares for new adventures, the young officer knows that his room for maneuver is seriously diminishing. The suspicion surrounding Magellan peaks when, at the end of 1513, he presents a detailed report of his campaigns in Lisbon. His discoveries concerning the circuits of gold, spices, and potential unknown routes intrigued the court, eager to dominate Oriental trade. Yet, some advisors accuse him of hiding personal gains. Deeply hurt, Magellan tries to prove his integrity by recalling his wounds and loyalty to the crown. He points out that he has risked his life to consolidate the empire in these often hostile, remote territories. The debates around his file drag on, revealing the fragility of the colonial system, shaken by constant rivalries. By the end of this period, his future remains uncertain. Some hope that he will still be able to distinguish himself in other campaigns, while others already suggest that he could seek new support outside of Portugal. In 1513, Fernão de Magalhães, already known as a seasoned officer during the Portuguese campaigns in the Indian Ocean, once again sets foot on his native soil. He returns from a series of expeditions that led him from Goa to Malacca, passing through various fortified trading posts established to consolidate Portuguese control over the spice trade. His temples more grizzled than at his departure, he also bears the scars of multiple confrontations. Yet, he does not receive the triumphant welcome one might expect. The experiences accumulated since his youth do not yet arouse the enthusiasm he had hoped for within the royal circles. In Lisbon, King Manuel III, crowned in 1495 and a great architect of Portuguese expansion, has already established a powerful fleet connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. The opening of the maritime route to the Indies by Vasco da Gama in 1498 solidified Portugal's reputation as the main naval power of the West. The wealth accumulated from the import of pepper, cinnamon, and other precious goods ensures the sovereign considerable influence. However, at the beginning of the 1510s, the kingdom must also face growing rivalries, notably with Castile, which aspires to exploit its own transatlantic discoveries. This imperialist context is accompanied by a succession of armadas regularly dispatched to the Indian Ocean, each with better armed ships and more seasoned sailors. One calls the Fourth Armada of the Indies one of these major expeditions, although there were many flotillas bearing official or unofficial names. The main objective remains the consolidation of the Portuguese ultramarine empire, defending conquered trading posts, establishing new fortresses, and forging lucrative alliances with local princely subjects or partners. Returns from these campaigns bring back booty, spices, slaves, and crucial geographic information for the crown. Magalhães, during his return between 1513 and 1514, provides a strategic assessment highlighting key Portuguese strongholds such as Goa, established in the western India region, and Malacca, located at the juncture between the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, ensuring new commercial flows. The region, rich in nutmeg, cloves, and silks, appears profitable. However, these military successes come at a high cost in human lives and lost ships. Storms, local revolts, and fierce competition from Arab and Indian merchants demand constant efforts. Before the king, Magalhães proposes an innovative project, pursuing expansion to the west to better circumscribe potential rivals. This project, which Magellan informally calls the Western Opening of the Moluccas, aims to reach the Indonesian archipelago of spices by bypassing the lands already controlled by Portugal in Africa and Asia. At this time, the Moluccas are reputed in the European mind as the ultimate source of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, a highly valuable aromatic triptych. Magellan's idea is to define a more direct route, likely to escape the controls imposed by the Ottomans in the Near East, and to minimize the high taxes demanded by intermediaries. The potential profits seem considerable. Yet, the reception of this proposal remains tinged with skepticism. Manuel Fernão, aware of the precariousness of his naval dominance in the face of Spanish adversity and the mutinies that sometimes erupt in his own fleets, does not seem willing to embark on another large-scale maritime venture. The crown's finances, although nurtured by African gold and Asian spices, are already largely dedicated to the defense and development of existing strongholds. Furthermore, there is a fear that a voyage across the southern Atlantic and beyond the Cape of Good Hope would spread military resources that are already under strain. Behind this financial argument also lies a certain personal mistrust towards Magellan. Despite his merits, he has long fostered enmities at court. He is accused, rightly or wrongly, of having conducted private trade in the Indian Ocean and of having profited from illicit transactions. His rank of gentleman, inherited from his ancestors, has not sufficed to build him a fortune, especially since the Portuguese nobility tends to be reserved towards ambitious officers of provincial origin. The king, influenced by certain advisors, therefore believes that betting on such a grandiose project carried by a contested figure involves risks. In Magellan's eyes, this royal stubbornness borders on strategic blindness. Indeed, he wishes to resolve the issue of the route to the Moluccas through a western path, convinced that there is a maritime passage south of the American continent, providing direct access to the Pacific Ocean. Although the exact geography remains uncertain, he bases his conviction on map readings, distant accounts from sailors who have explored the Atlantic coast of America, and speculations arising from the theory of the sphericity of the Earth. Convinced of his plan's potential, he nonetheless faces royal intransigence. In 1515, while the court is busy reinforcing its positions on the route to the East Indies, Magellan tries once again to plead his case. he submits a detailed memorandum indicating supposed latitude and longitude calculations as well as maritime distance estimates to reach Asia via the west. The goal, according to him, is to anticipate any similar maneuver by Castile, which is receiving more and more reports on possible straits south of the New World. Despite his persistence, the response from the palace remains the same. Portugal, already engaged in the Indian theater, has no interest in further dispersing its efforts. Personal tensions between Magellan and the authorities intensify following a particular incident. It is said that in 1515, in an effort to regain royal favor, he offers his services for a campaign in North Africa, specifically in the region of Azemar on the western coast of Morocco. The Portuguese maintain a garrison there to block the pirates' route and guarantee their control of the coastline. During this operation, Magellan is accused, likely unjustly, of appropriating part of the spoils. An investigative commission is set up, and even though the charges against him prove insufficiently founded, suspicion remains. This affair, coupled with his maritime project still being rejected, gradually seals the rift between Magellan and the Portuguese court. He, who had hoped to see his sovereign embrace a new route or even promote him to a higher rank, finds himself increasingly sidelined from the decision-making circles. His contacts among sailors and cartographers, accumulated since his years of service in India, nevertheless encourage him to persevere. They know there is a growing appetite for new routes. They encourage Magellan to present his proposal to other monarchs, ready to finance a voyage capable of bringing unforeseen glory and profits. Around 1516, an opportunity arises in Castile. On the throne, Queen Joanna the Mad, daughter of the Catholic monarchs, is declared unfit to reign, leaving her son, the young Charles, the future Charles V, to exercise growing authority. Despite his young age, he has inherited the universal ambitions of his maternal grandparents. The royal advisors of Castile are seeking new ways to bypass the Portuguese monopoly in the Indian Ocean. They are particularly interested in the idea of finding a western route to the Spice Islands, a commercial grail that could bolster Castilian power on the European scene. Magellan, aware of this political context, requests leave from the Portuguese court, claiming he wishes to retire for a few months to handle family affairs. In reality, he is contemplating a shift in allegiance, but wishes to preserve his noble honor. Changing flags should not be seen as an act of treason against his native kingdom, but rather as a logical evolution for someone who no longer finds support from his sovereign. The Portuguese laws are strict. It is forbidden for a subject of Manuel I to engage in the service of a foreign monarch without explicit authorization. However, the authorization never arrives. Magellan eventually decides to leave Lisbon. Accompanied by his friend and collaborator Rui Falero, a talented astronomer, he first travels to Seville, a flourishing Castilian port city since the success of the Colombian expeditions. There, he knows he will be able to plead his case directly to the officials of King Charles and also benefit from local technical expertise. For more than 2 decades, Seville has been home to shipyards and cartography offices where Castilian transatlantic ambitions are mapped out. This departure, discreet but calculated, marks the beginning of a new chapter. The decision to switch to the Castilian banner reflects Magellan's determination to realize his dream, finding a western route to the Moluccas that would ensure an advantageous position in the spice race. To outside observers, this change of allegiance is not trivial. It demonstrates the limits of peaceful collaboration between the Iberian powers, despite previous agreements such as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Political dealings intensify as Spain sees in Magellan's expertise a major asset to challenge Portuguese maritime supremacy. Existing tensions risk turning into open conflict. In 1518, Europe is in the midst of political and religious upheaval, while Castile, unified under the Spanish crown, seeks to consolidate its power beyond the continent. It is in this context that Fernão de Magalhães, now known by his Castilian name Fernando de Magalhães, approaches the young sovereign Charles V, crowned King of Spain in 1516 and Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, to propose an audacious project to find a new route to the Spice Islands located in the Moluccas archipelago by heading west. The possibilities of exploiting rich deposits of cloves, nutmeg, and other valuable goods greatly interest Charles V, who also sees an opportunity to assert his authority over the seas. Following long and delicate negotiations, Magellan receives a promise of financial support, subject to strict conditions, and is granted official passages guaranteeing his status as the head of the expedition. 1/10 of the profits will be awarded to him, along with the title of governor of the discovered lands. The legal form of this enterprise, modeled on the Spanish mercantile practices of the time, gives rise to several contracts called asientos. Through these agreements, the Crown commits to covering part of the expedition's costs, while Magellan and his financial partner, the Portuguese Rui Faleiro, must provide their own material and intellectual contribution. In exchange, letters of patent, signed by Charles V on March 22, 1518, officially grant Magellan quasi-sovereign powers over the new territories he hopes to conquer. These letters specify the explorer's obligations regarding conversion to Christianity, a goal he must pursue alongside commercial and geographical exploration. New to the Spanish sphere, Magellan nonetheless surrounds himself with advisors familiar with administrative intricacies to negotiate each clause in his favor. The challenge is significant: to prove that a navigable route to the west could lead to the Spice Islands without violating the Treaty of Tordesillas line, which has separated the spheres of influence of Portugal and Castile since 1494. To convince the monarch, Magellan emphasizes the precious knowledge he acquired during his Asian campaigns in the service of Portugal. He notably brings marine charts compiled by Portuguese and Arab navigators, charts he claims to improve with his own experience. However, Magellan knows he also needs to play on Charles V's competitive streak, rivaling a Portuguese king very protective of his trade monopolies. He promises the Spanish sovereign not only a new trade route, but also the prospect of depriving Portugal of the immense profits related to the spice trade. This is a significant argument for a Spanish empire in full expansion, already owner of the territories discovered by Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean and on the American continent. Thus, the support of Charles V is part of the continuation of a maritime opening policy, reinforced by the goal of surpassing the neighboring kingdom. The official documents underline the challenge, establish Castilian hegemony over the spice routes, and bolster the prestige of the new monarch. The promise of 1/10 of the profits is an essential element for Magellan, whose personal fortune remains limited. This prospect of personal enrichment justifies the enormous risks he takes, both diplomatically and maritally. Alongside Rui Faleiro, who provides scientific backing to the enterprise thanks to his astronomical knowledge, the explorer stakes part of his future heritage to arm the ships. The sources of supply for food, arms, and nautical equipment are negotiated on credit or thanks to advances from Seville merchants. Despite his caution, Magellan quickly finds himself forced to multiply loans, fueling the suspicion of some Spanish courtiers who see him as an adventurer or even a spy in the service of Portugal. However, Charles V, in search of glory and wealth, maintains his trust in this Portuguese-born officer. He is convinced that the fierce competition between the Iberian crowns and the desire to thwart Lusitanian plans can justify betting on this determined man. In the port of Seville, the excitement grows as the project takes shape. 5 ships are being fitted out for the expedition: the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. The shipyard mobilizes carpenters, sailmakers, caulkers, and blacksmiths. The Trinidad, which will be the flagship, is a sturdy square-rigged 3-master suited for long-distance navigation. The San Antonio, larger, is intended for the transport of men and provisions. The Concepcion, of intermediate tonnage, and the Victoria, lighter, will serve respectively as exploration vessels and rapid support ships. Finally, the Santiago occupies a scouting role, able to engage in rivers and shallow waters to identify difficult passages. Magellan closely monitors each stage of the construction, insisting on equipping the ships with precise measuring instruments, such as astrolabes, compasses, and a large stock of portolan charts. The objective is clear: to depart with a relatively modest fleet, but one robust and flexible enough for the unknown awaiting its sailors. The crew proves to be particularly cosmopolitan, reflecting the political situation in the Iberian Peninsula and the attraction that the expedition exerts. Basque sailors, renowned for their navigation skills, mingle with Portuguese who, like Magellan, have chosen to serve Castile. There are also Genoese, specialists in cartography and maritime finance, as well as Flemish individuals attracted by the prospect of quick profits. Slaves of African or Asian origin are also embarked, tasked with menial jobs, and sometimes valuable for communication with encountered peoples if they share a common language or dialect. In total, about 270 men are preparing to set sail. Despite the diversity of their origins, they share the same goal: to leave Europe in search of glory, wealth, or simply to escape misery. Tensions are not lacking. The ethnic rivalry and religious differences do not disappear overnight, but all know that the success of the expedition depends on their cohesion and discipline. These sailors, of varying ranks and statuses, often sign a contract whose terms are strictly defined. Senior officers, appointed as captains or navigation masters, receive higher pay in recognition of their responsibilities. The ordinary sailors, on the other hand, are more modestly paid and sometimes must settle for a share of the future bounty. Magellan nonetheless strives to establish common rules: strict prohibition against stealing or hiding goods, equitable distribution of provisions, codified punishments for mutineers. This attempt at internal regulations aims to maintain order in a confined environment, far from any external authority. Discipline is especially necessary because the expedition is not a pleasure cruise. Every maneuvering or behavioral error can cost the entire crew their lives. The contracts thus serve to bind the men to a common cause, while clearly indicating the sanctions provided in case of disobedience within a legally accepted framework by all. Beyond the human aspect, the issue of geographical knowledge occupies a crucial place in preparing the expedition. Charles V orders his cartographers to provide Magellan with the most up-to-date information, while ensuring that certain state secrets are preserved. Chronicles report that so-called secret maps circulate among Crown officers, including approximate estimates of longitudes in the southern hemisphere. In reality, the precision of these data remains mediocre, and most maps still rely on Ptolemaic geography or on the partial surveys of Portuguese navigators. Magellan himself is uncertain of the exact location of the Moluccas westward, hence the need to establish maritime routes by navigating with dead reckoning and cross-referencing star observations. Despite these uncertainties, the deliberate spread of false longitudes also serves as a deterrent to mislead potential spies and sow confusion among rival powers, even before the ship's actual departure. At the dawn of the year 1519, all these preparations lead to an unprecedented situation in European maritime history. Never before had a fleet, financed by Castile and placed under the command of a Portuguese captain general, gathered so much expertise and resources with the explicit goal of circumventing Lusitanian dominance over spices. The economic and geopolitical pressures exerted by Portugal are felt, while Magellan's political supporters display their determination to prove the righteousness of their gamble. Religious tensions between converts and old Christians add a permanent atmosphere of suspicion among the crew. However, the ambitious energy of this heterogeneous group, coupled with Magellan's fierce will, ultimately prevails. Detailed inventories show that the fleet carries enough gunpowder, provisions, and spare tools to last several months at sea, even if uncertainty remains about the precise location of the Western Passage. The signed contracts, sealed letters of patent, and promises of rewards etched in mines, everything seems ready for adventure. As early as mid-August 1519, the expedition of Fernão de Magalhães, commonly called Magellan in Castilian documentation, was preparing to leave Seville to embark on its long journey. The 5 ships, the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago, were moored on the Guadalquivir, where there was an excitement typical of grand departures. The holds were filled with provisions, weapons, and spare parts, while the crew tirelessly checked the final details. On shore, merchants, onlookers, and relatives gathered to watch this promising fleet, whose official mission was to find a new route to the Spice Islands, located according to maps, somewhere in the eastern Indian Ocean. This project, funded by the Castilian monarchy of Charles V, sought in reality to bypass the Portuguese commercial monopoly established around the Cape of Good Hope. Rumors were circulating that Magellan possessed secret information that would allow him to find a western passage to the Pacific Ocean. Already the atmosphere was electric. Some sailors doubted the relevance of such an undertaking. Others saw in Magellan, of Portuguese nationality, only an opportunist ready to serve a foreign sovereign. Whatever the case, the order to set sail was imminent. At the head of this flotilla, Magellan displayed great rigor. His experience gained in the Indian Ocean in the service of Portugal forged his reputation as a competent officer in navigation and astronomy. However, his authority was not fully recognized by everyone. Within his own expedition council, one person particularly stood out, Juan de Cartagena, a high-ranking Castilian appointed by Charles IX as captain of the San Antonio and Royal Inspector. In other words, an observer tasked with representing the interests of the crown. Cartagena quickly proved to be ambitious and felt legitimized to contest Magellan's decisions. This latent rivalry partly stemmed from the necessary balance Magellan had to maintain. He was the chief of the mission, but also subordinate to the Castilian throne, supported by a cosmopolitan crew, among which were Portuguese, Basques, Genoese, Flemish, and Spaniards from different provinces. Each watched the other's moves, ready to interpret any maneuver as a political scheme. In this heavy context, the departure had to strictly adhere to the schedule decided by the Casa de Contratación of Seville to avoid any delay that could arouse suspicion or harm troop morale. On August 20th, 1519, the flotilla officially left the port of Seville and descended the Guadalquivir to reach the coast. After several days of river navigation, the small squadron reached Sanlúcar de Barrameda, the last stop before the open sea. There, Magellan conducted one last inspection of the ships. He ensured that the provisions, including biscuits, wine, oil, salted fish, and canned meat, were properly stored. The navigation instruments, such as the astrolabe and the quadrant, needed to be calibrated for the northern hemisphere, awaiting necessary adjustments when they would cross the equator. The maps, mostly inspired by recent Portuguese discoveries, remained incomplete. No one yet had a complete vision of the route to be taken. Several officers, including Cartagena, grew impatient, feeling that these checks unnecessarily delayed progress. Magellan, on his part, did not want to leave anything to chance, aware that the slightest technical failure at sea could ruin the expedition. When the squadron finally set sail for good, heading to the Canary Islands, the atmosphere on board was both eager and anxious. The 5 ships initially advanced together, following the same currents and watching the signals from the harbor master. Eyes often turned to the sky, searching for meteorological indicators. As they approached the Canary Islands, a traditional resupply point for sailors setting out for the Atlantic, each captain worked to maintain formation. Magellan, meanwhile, regularly received reports from the master of each ship to assess the state of the fleet. During this time, tensions between him and Cartagena simmered quietly. The instructions imposed a hierarchical respect. Magellan was the admiral, tasked with coordinating the whole, while Cartagena only commanded one ship. Yet, in the cabin's corridors, murmurs suggested that Cartagena considered himself a direct representative of Charles V and felt underestimated. In the Canaries, resupply is done quickly. Barrels of drinking water are reloaded, fruit stocks are replenished to prevent scurvy, and cargoes of spearheads and gunpowder are collected to be prepared for any confrontation. Magellan takes the opportunity to check the accuracy of the magnetic compass, which has had its declination adjusted according to latitude. After a few days of stopover, he gives the order to head southwest, towards the African coast, to take advantage of the regularly blowing trade winds. The route to the equator is intended to be relatively direct. Portuguese experience, gained under Henry the Navigator and his successors, has shown that the best strategy for crossing the southern Atlantic is to let the winds carry the sails out to sea, then to skirt the Gulf of Guinea to pick up a more favorable current. Nevertheless, Magellan prepares a subtle variation of this plan, often called reverse coasting, which involves descending along the African coast for part of the journey before veering off to avoid the doldrums. This method is time-consuming, but provides safe landmarks and opportunities for resupply if necessary, while keeping an eye on the ocean currents. This zigzag progression does not please most of the officers. Cartagena, in particular, finds the maneuver too timid. He would prefer to take the route that cuts directly across the ocean to gain speed. Magellan, however, invokes his personal experience with the Atlantic winds. He recalls that off the Gulf of Guinea, and then at Cape Verde's level, a ship can easily become trapped in a windless sea or, conversely, suffer unpredictable storms. Safety is paramount, especially considering the crucial mission, preserving the ships in good condition for the following journey, as no one yet knows what the exploration of the southern hemisphere holds beyond the already notoriously difficult Portuguese routes. Tensions are expressed in veiled words. In the cabin of the San Antonio, heated discussions take place on Magellan's orders, with some officers stating that too much delay could jeopardize the discovery and put the enterprise's profitability at risk. Cartagena, feeling strengthened by the occasional support of a few close allies, doesn't hesitate to question the choice of anchorages. However, faced with the majority who remain loyal to the admiral, he refrains for now from openly challenging his authority. By the end of September, the expedition finds itself near the latitude close to the equator. The winds change quickly, and the temperature rises on board. In these waters, Magellan applies the technique he learned in the Indian Ocean, watching for cloud formations at dawn to anticipate tropical squalls and position the ship optimally. The logs report that the heat intensifies, forcing the sailors to moderate their efforts on deck. The officers focus on cartography by consulting the portalens, those marine maps showing coastlines, and attempting to establish a precise course. The use of the astrolabe remains complicated, as the ship's list and frequent rolling make, measuring the solar angle uncertain. For each reading, Magellan requests multiple measurements and often favors caution when it comes time to assess their actual position. He knows that the slightest error could steer them too far west or east, further prolonging an already arduous journey. Over the weeks, the camaraderie on board gradually disintegrates. Supplies remain sufficient, but the water begins to warm, the food loses its flavor, and the close quarters foster friction. Some quarrels break out among the crew, sometimes over trivial reasons, disagreement over chore distribution or suspicions of theft. Magellan also has to deal with the forced presence of these hastily recruited sailors, some of whom speak neither Spanish nor Portuguese. Orders circulate through gestures and makeshift interpreters. The heavy canvases of the sails, constantly subjected to the breeze, must be adjusted with changing directions. All observe the discipline that Magellan tries to impose, waking at dawn, strict guard duty distribution, and swift punishments for those who break the rules. He manages to impose minimal cohesion, but the echo of mistrust persists. In October, the South American coast is finally in sight. The ships approach the current coastline of Brazil, then a territory claimed by the Portuguese based on the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. Nevertheless, this geographical point is of only partial interest to Magellan, who knows that Castile is not allowed to trade on these lands. The squadron, however, lands in a secluded cove to replenish their supply of fresh water and allow the sailors to rest. Encounters with the local populations remain limited because Magellan does not wish to provoke a diplomatic incident with the Portuguese crown. On this occasion, it is reported that Juan de Cartagena severely criticizes the decision to remain discreet. He believes that the crew could have traded some goods or bolstered the fleet with local recruits or even additional provisions. Magellan, however, prefers to respect the mission as understood by the Castilian crown. They must move south and seek a passage rather than burden themselves with potential political complications. During the descent along the coast, the pilots adopt the technique of inverted coastal navigation. The idea is to anchor regularly, at defined intervals, to check the presence of bays or estuaries that might penetrate deeply into the land. Magellan has in mind the project of discovering a strait or passage that would lead to another ocean. The writings of Portuguese cartographers, as well as some navigators' accounts, suggest that a strait might exist somewhere at the continent's extreme south. For now, the shoreline turns out to be sometimes sandy, sometimes covered with dense forests. Nothing resembles a waterway crossing the continent. The search continues, and the first frustrations appear among officers eager to report concrete results. The boat expeditions, conducted from the Trinidad or the Concepcion, consistently return with modest topographic surveys and few notable discoveries. Some sailors begin to wonder if this quest is illusory. Cartagena watches these comings and goings with skepticism, convinced that Magellan is wasting their precious time. In November, the advance continues toward cooler latitudes. The climate changes, the air cools at night, and humidity rises aboard the ships. The provisions, though still adequate, begin to dwindle. At each stopover, the sailors attempt to fish or hunt to improve the food supply. In the journals, there is an increase in notes on the men's health conditions. Some suffer from intermittent fevers, others complain of pains related to harsher living conditions. Magellan, always concerned with group cohesion, regularly gathers the captains to ensure the proper execution of tasks. The hierarchy, nevertheless, remains conflictual. Cartagena, relying on his status as a court favorite, repeats his criticisms daily before the officers. Magellan, more reserved, does not always respond, preferring to refer to his immediate advisors and record the grievances in a logbook. The tensions keep accumulating, like a threatening cloud that everyone perceives on the horizon. At the beginning of December, the ships are in sight of what will later be named the Rio de la Plata, a large estuary separating present-day Argentina and Uruguay. At the time, it is not yet known whether it is an arm of the sea or a promising river. Magellan wants to verify with certainty if this immense mouth continues as a passage to the west, which he hopes is the strait leading to the other ocean. He sends boats for reconnaissance, with pilots tasked with sounding the depth and making surveys. The operation takes time. The estuary is vast, and the sailors must fight against strong currents. The soundings reveal increasingly less salty water as they go upstream, indicating that it is primarily a gigantic river rather than the long hoped-for passage. In view of the findings, Magellan decides that the fleet must proceed further south. If a strait exists, it is not here. As disappointment spreads among the crew, a new subject fuels the discussions: the supposed presence of giants in the more southern lands. For several months, rumors have been circulating, gathered from coastal fishermen encountered along the way. There is talk of a land inhabited by men so tall that they would leave outsized footprints in the sand. The Castilian sailors, quick to exaggerate dimensions, speak of footprints measuring more than half that of an ordinary human foot. The Portuguese pilots point out that in Africa, too, there were myths of giants before anyone actually saw them. Magellan, however, knows that there are indigenous peoples of great stature south of the continent. If he meets them, he hopes to approach them peacefully. This curiosity is also driven by a political objective: to forge alliances, or, at the very least, to learn more about the resources of this region. In one of his rare apartés with Cartagena, Magellan explains that he is not opposed to inland exploration, but that he must first keep the crew focused on discovering the passage. Cartagena retorts that these giant stories are nothing but fables, good for distracting the overly superstitious sailors. As they approach the more southern coasts, the landscape changes noticeably. The beaches become rockier, the wind grows colder, and the reliefs rise on the horizon. The pilots note a drop in temperature that forces the crew to rediscover blankets and thicker clothing. The supply of wood begins to pose a problem, as it becomes difficult to find dense forests in these now more arid expanses. Nevertheless, Magellan has no intention of turning back. He plans to take advantage of each stop to question any potential inhabitants and examine the local fauna. According to the few accounts that have indirectly reached him, Patagonia is said to be inhabited by nomadic communities with their own traditions. The Indians they've briefly glimpsed seem fierce and hard to locate, but initial clues gathered from sentinels sent ashore suggest that the population moves in small groups. The beaches sometimes bear traces of campfires, fish carcasses, and empty shells that indicate seasonal activity. Rumors among the crew suggest that the stature of these people is indeed above the European average, feeding the legend of these Patagons or Patagones. Around mid-December, the fleet is approximately at the latitude of the mouth of the Rio de la Plata and ventures further south. Navigation conditions worsen gradually. The wind strengthens and the sea becomes less clement. The rollers threaten the stability of the lighter caravels, and the admiral must ensure that the formation stays grouped. Valued for its scientific worth, the astrolabe requires ever more precision to determine their position as the latitude increases and the nights lengthen slightly. On board the Trinidad, it is noted that the compass begins to display an unprecedented magnetic variation. Magellan requests that daily reports be written to try to anticipate any more dangerous malfunctions. Madrid, thousands of kilometers away, receives no news, and no one can count on any kind of reinforcement. The same goes for the provisions. If the fleet doesn't find a new reliable water source, the situation may become complicated. Tensions between Magellan and Cartagena are rekindled when it comes to choosing a safe place to stop. Cartagena demands to push further to find a suitable anchorage, while Magellan, cautious, prefers to examine every nook and cranny. The two men sometimes clash in front of their officers, each arguing that a wrong decision would put the ships in peril. According to Cartagena, the southern winter is approaching, and lingering too long in hostile territories could break the morale of the troops or even damage ships already under strain. Magellan, however, doesn't want to leave any potential bay unexplored. What may seem like a dead end could turn out to be a passage of crucial importance. In these daily debates, almost everyone eventually tires of the internal conflicts, but none wishes to permanently alienate one authority or the other. Over these weeks, several officers quietly wonder if Magellan's stubbornness to maintain a slow pace will eventually provoke a mutiny. Cultural disparities also manifest significantly within the crew. The sailors of Portuguese origin say they are more inclined to trust Magellan, whom they perceive as one of their own, despite his service under Charles V. The strictly obedient Castilians remain suspicious and gravitate towards Cartagena, who better understands their codes and language. The Basques remain relatively neutral, as long as they are assured of their pay and the potential for a share of the profits. The Genoese assess the situation with caution, having previously collaborated with Portuguese ship owners and knowing how explosive the political climate between Castile and Portugal can be. In this complex context, Magellan relies on firm control. Punishment and reward alternate with the sole aim of preserving the continuity of the expedition. As December comes to an end, the southern landscape is already revealing its first mysteries: steep cliffs, misty islands, and rocky plateaus that, from the ship's deck, evoke a mix of fear and fascination. The Spanish pilots take note of every cove and protruding rock, attempting to name these places for recording on their rudimentary maps. The sailors, meanwhile, recollect exotic tales describing gigantic beings. They scan the coast in search of signs of life. Occasionally, distant silhouettes are believed to be seen, moving in small groups, but it's impossible to accurately gauge their size from afar. On a strictly practical level, the question remains whether the local indigenous people would be open to trading or exchanging supplies. Magellan is convinced that peaceful contact is possible, provided that caution is maintained. However, he is unaware that these future encounters will always carry a risk, as mistrust between foreigners and natives is often exacerbated by linguistic and cultural misunderstandings. The days gradually lengthen in this southern hemisphere, approaching the summer solstice around December 21st. The European sailors, unaccustomed to such a reversal of seasons, struggle to adapt. While the old helmsman Vasco Gallego carefully measures the solar elevation each morning, the quartermasters try to ration the wine and dried meat reserves. The supplies are not yet depleted, but the flotilla's course is making resupply increasingly uncertain. In the various briefings held on the Trinidad, a crucial question is raised. Should they push further if no obvious maritime passage presents itself? Cartagena, supported by a few impatient officers, prefers to force fate and reach an even lower latitude, where, according to some rumors, the passage might be open. Nevertheless, Magellan orders a thorough check of each major estuary to ensure they don't miss any potential outlet to the other ocean. He justifies this gradual approach by explaining that, nearly a century ago, the Portuguese discovered unsuspected bays along the African coast. The lack of reliable information about the giant's homeland reinforces Magellan's belief that they must advance methodically while monitoring the crew's morale. Juan de Cartagena is not only upset by these decisions, but also criticizes the way Magellan uses discipline to maintain his hold. Some sailors have been punished for simple mistakes, like joking about the expedition's delay or drinking too much wine during their watch. The captain of the San Antonio considers these measures excessive, viewing them as a sign of pride and distrust from the Portuguese admiral. On board the Victoria, Luis de Mendoza, another Castilian officer, echoes these complaints and communicates them directly to the quartermasters, who, in turn, fuel the rumor that Magellan wants to control everything unconditionally. In this already very tense atmosphere, it would take just a skirmish or a broken cable to ignite the accumulated resentments. Nonetheless, despite this toxic climate, the expedition continues its journey along the coast, seeking the elusive passage. December draws to a close, and the small fleet gradually slides towards what is known today as the 40th parallel south. The evidence is clear. The warm season is settled in this part of the world, even though the sea remains rough. The ships, tossed from wave to wave, continue to search for the slightest suspicious cove, a hidden channel, or an unsuspected arm of the sea. The pilots sometimes share doubts about the viability of the project. The maps of the time, inspired by Ptolemaic geography and enriched by Portuguese knowledge, only indicate a vast unknown. However, the lure of profit and the prospect of glory are enough to maintain the momentum. Among the crew, only a small minority of men express a willingness to turn back. The senior officers, for the most part, prefer to obey rather than risk being accused of desertion or treason. Among them, some still wonder what will happen if a storm surprises them in these uncharted waters, or if the very concept of this passage is but a cartographic mirage. The coming months will inevitably bring challenges, and the shadow of the purported giants continuously lingers in their tabletop stories. They speak of Patagonia as a land both mysterious and hostile, evoking fascination and dread among sailors who sometimes cast anxious glances towards the horizon. In March 1520, the Castilian fleet commanded by Fernão de Magalhães, known today as Magellan, anchors in the natural harbor of San Julián, in the south of present-day Argentine Patagonia. At the time, this region was part of a territory almost unknown to most Europeans. The winds there are constant and violent, the seas capricious, and the climate distinctly harsher than in Castile or Portugal. The sailors, for the most part unaccustomed to such latitudes, have only limited equipment to combat the cold and damp. Upon their arrival, they discover that the approaching austral winter will be relentless. Any movement ashore is difficult, as the frozen ground and barren rocks offer little shelter. Magellan's decision to stop at San Julián is not random. He believes this adequately sheltered bay can protect the ships until fair weather arrives, while also providing opportunities for land exploration. The fleet then consists of 5 ships: the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. Among these vessels, Each has its own captain, often of different origins, which adds to the complexity of internal discipline within the expedition. Amidst the growing hostility of the climate, Magellan understands that establishing a survival routine is necessary to maintain cohesion and health among the men. He orders the construction of temporary shelters ashore to store some of the provisions and allow some sailors to rest off the ships. However, the quality of provisions is already beginning to decline as the salted meat and biscuits, the staples of the ship's diet, do not keep well in the icy dampness. The sailors are often chilled, and morale deteriorates as the weeks pass. Some suspect that Magellan does not know exactly where he is, or that he overestimates the ease of discovering a passage further south. Others, weary from the harshness of operations, question the legitimacy of Castilian authority, as several officers, like Captain Luis de Mendoza, harbor deep resentment towards this command they sometimes deem too authoritarian. This results in tense exchanges in the cabins, where dissatisfaction and distrust are expressed. For his part, Magellan watches each captain attentively. Under his guidance, punishments occur swiftly when someone is accused of open disobedience. Surveillance of the food barrels becomes more stringent, and any hint of theft of food or drink can lead to immediate punishment, even confinement. At the beginning of April 1520, the accumulated tensions reached a critical point. Several officers openly contested the conduct of the expedition. Among them were Juan de Cartagena, direct representative of Charles V, and Gaspar de Quesada, who commanded the Concepcion. They reproached Magellan for his overly harsh methods and his refusal to be transparent about the exact destination. This uprising took advantage of the ambient weariness, the fear of spending a whole winter in this icy desert, hesitation about the continuation of the journey, and the difficulties of supplies created an explosive atmosphere. One night, under the cover of darkness, a group of mutineers took control of the San Antonio and the Concepcion, hoping to force Magellan to abandon his plan. Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria, also joined the mutiny, giving the rebels considerable weight. But Magellan, stationed aboard the Trinidad, reacted quickly. He sent loyal men in a boat to reclaim the Victoria in a swift assault and captured Mendoza, who was summarily executed shortly thereafter. Cartagena and Quesada, deprived of leadership, were made prisoners. Immediately afterward, Magellan regained control of the Concepcion. The revolt, although serious, was crushed with an iron fist in just a few days. After the aborted mutiny, Magellan organized quick trials to make an impression and reaffirm his authority. Gaspar de Quesada was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. Cartagena, due to his status as a royal representative, escaped immediate execution, but was stripped of all his duties and kept in detention. Many sailors, shocked by the brutality of these judgments, withdrew into a seemingly forced silence of obedience. However, Magellan insisted on justifying his decisions by reminding that the expedition survived only through discipline and unity. For him, a mutiny in the midst of the Patagonian winter threatened the entire mission and would condemn everyone to a miserable end. The falling heads thus served as a direct warning to anyone still contemplating desertion or sabotage. The sailors who hesitated to rally to the rebellion quickly understood that it was better to comply with orders, at least until the next opportunity to challenge this inflexible captain. The punishments were not limited to capital punishment. Some mutineers received lashes or were chained in the hold without the possibility of warming themselves or receiving anything other than the bare minimum in supplies. Despite this tense atmosphere, The necessity of subsisting in this inhospitable port remained the priority. The days grew shorter, and the temperature dropped further. Frost covered the ropes of the ships in the early morning, making maneuvering perilous and requiring constant maintenance. The men were sometimes sent to hunt or fish in the surrounding area, although the wildlife proved elusive. Some seals and seabirds supplemented the ordinary meals, thus avoiding famine. Inside each hull, the cramped conditions aggravated the risk of disease propagation. Fevers appeared, and some sailors succumbed to the lack of real care. The few local herbs gathered near the shore or on the islets offered no miraculous cure. However, Magellan relied on strict hygiene to limit contagion. He imposed cleaning routines on the deck, checked the quality of drinking water, and encouraged collective prayers to maintain morale. The priests on board regularly celebrated masses, trying to calm the fear of divine abandonment in these distant lands. Those who hesitated to participate in religious services did not dare to show their skepticism too much for fear of being accused of sowing trouble. Everyone strove to find a semblance of routine, but weariness remained palpable. During these interminable months, the question of coastal exploration remains crucial. Magellan wishes to locate possible passages to hasten the progress of the expedition. He assigns the Santiago, one of the lighter ships, the mission of sailing along the coast and charting coves that might lead to a strait. During this reconnaissance, the crew of the Santiago endures the same extreme conditions: violent winds, unpredictable currents, and freezing temperatures. At one point, as they attempt to anchor near a rocky shore, a storm suddenly rises. Waves crash into the hull while the rudder becomes nearly impossible to maneuver. The captain of the Santiago tries to drop the anchor, but the fury of the elements drives the ship against the reefs. The wood creaks, the sails tear, and the terrified crew must abandon the vessel to its fate. Many manage to reach land by swimming or using rescue boats, but some sailors disappear into the waves. The loss of the Santiago is a severe blow to everyone's morale, as it demonstrates how treacherous this coastline is. When the shipwrecked finally reach San Julian, they bring back the bitter news of barely escaping death, while the ship is irretrievably lost. The shipwreck of the Santiago prompts a general questioning of Magellan's methods. Some crew members, already weakened and demoralized, fear that other ships might suffer the same fate. Officers loyal to the Captain General try to reassure the men by emphasizing that this loss, though tragic, provides them with a valuable warning about the dangers of these wild coasts. Nevertheless, many questions arise. Wouldn't it be better to return to Europe rather than perish in this frozen land without any guarantee of success? The most intrepid keep hope alive for a passage to what they call the South Sea, while the more cautious dread prolonged entrapment. Days drag on, and spirits slowly collapse. Several land explorations yield only meager resources without revealing a new navigable route. Tensions resurface from time to time, as Magellan must constantly remind them of the strict obedience and absolute necessity of staying united. The fate of Cartagena and Quesada always serves as an example, even if many deem these punishments excessive. Faced with the constant vigilance against mutiny, managing rations, and the imminence of the full winter, the crew finds itself in a precarious situation that tests everyone's will. The following weeks mark a slow slide into other ordeals, as the cold intensifies even more. The lack of a clear prospect weighs heavily on the minds of the tired sailors and officers. Each day resembles the last, and everyone fears that a new tragedy might strike the flotilla. In October 1520, the expedition commanded by Fernão de Magalhães, better known by the French name Ferdinand Magellan, arrived at the southern tip of South America. After the harrowing wintering in the port of San Julian, located in present-day Argentine Patagonia, the fleet's officers anxiously awaited the possibility of a passage to the west. The hopes of finding a strait linking the Atlantic Ocean to an unknown sea, a hypothesis fueled by previous rumors, motivated every member of the crew, despite the harsh climatic conditions. Days passed, punctuated by freezing gusts and the darkness of the southern hemisphere as they approached the coast. The ships still seaworthy were the Trinidad, the flagship directly commanded by Magalhães, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, as well as the San Antonio. Each carried sailors of different origins. Some came from Spain, others from Portugal, Italy, the Flanders, or even elsewhere. The tensions arising from the hostile climate and the memory of past mutinies were still palpable. Nevertheless, Magalhães let nothing show. For him, the quest for the passage remained paramount. The pilots continuously checked the alignment of the stars with the astrolabe, consulted their maps, and endeavored to discern among these jagged coasts the entrance of a channel leading to the unknown. At the beginning of this October 1520, the lookouts regularly reported bays, mouths, or coves likely to reveal a navigable corridor. Magellan sometimes sent small boats for reconnaissance, entrusting the mission to experienced officers. These scouts advanced cautiously, as the currents could be treacherous and the reefs numerous. Sudden tides demanded constant vigilance. On several occasions, the expedition resorted to on-the-spot cartography, while the sailors took soundings to measure the depth. The mapmakers, working hastily, sketched rough outlines of the coast, noting every detail. The geographical complexity of this region was not understood by the Europeans. They did not know how far this land stretched, nor whether it was just a huge island. The coastline was broken up into countless fjords, channels, and arms of the sea, making progress hazardous. The pilots used landmarks in the landscape, such as strange cliffs or snowy peaks, to make their first draft routes. At the time, there were no precise surveys or advanced navigation means to find one's way through such tortuous passages. Any mistake could doom a vessel to drift, or worse, to shipwreck. Finally, on October 21st, 1520, a canal was spotted that seemed to penetrate deeply inland. Magellan stopped the fleet at its entrance and sent sailors to measure its width and depth. The operation lasted several days, as it was necessary to ensure that the current did not lead to a dead end. The scouts returned with meticulous and encouraging observations. They reported that this maritime arm appeared to extend well beyond the first curve. To increase his chances of success, Magellan decided to cautiously enter this corridor, alternating periods of navigation and rudimentary mapping campaigns. Over the days, this maritime path proved to be winding, bordered by steep mountains and impenetrable deep forests. The often misty atmosphere added to the sense of mystery. The cold remained sharp, and the wind blew in gusts, threatening to drive the ships onto inhospitable rocks. Despite these difficulties, the fleet advanced slowly, guided by Magellan's determination, who saw in this laborious advance the prospect of realizing a dream, reaching a truly unknown sea, bypassing the American landmass. The officers noted every turn, every side bay, making records as precise as possible. Between the end of October and the beginning of November 1520, multiple branches of the strait appeared, forcing the expedition to split its forces to better explore these different paths. Magellan sent the Concepcion and the San Antonio to explore one branch, while the Trinidad and the Victoria attempted another. The days were short and the nights freezing, sometimes forcing the sailors to anchor in makeshift coves. The charts were filled with notes indicating strong currents, water flow speeds, and relief features. This methodical work aimed primarily to avoid getting caught in a dead end. On November 1st, All Saints' Day in the Christian tradition, the fleet finally regrouped in a large marine corridor free of reefs. Magellan, imbued with religiosity, decided to name this passage the Strait of Todos los Santos, in reference to this liturgical celebration. Although the name would later be shortened and changed, this initial title emphasized the spiritual significance that the Captain General attached to this discovery. For him, this natural corridor represented a divine sign, a confirmation of the righteousness of his enterprise. The men, exhausted but exhilarated, greeted this initiative with respectful cheers. However, behind the apparent enthusiasm, concerns persisted. The pilots wondered if this strait really led to an unknown ocean, or if it was just a maritime labyrinth leading nowhere. Provisions were dwindling, and fresh food was certainly in short supply. To continue the exploration, Magellan ordered further rationing of food and water. Tensions resurfaced among some officers who found the venture too risky. Memories of the San Julian mutiny, which had occurred a few months earlier, still haunted their minds. Despite everything, the decision was made to push further, proving the unwavering determination of the commander. A few days after the symbolic discovery and naming of the Strait of Todos los Santos, the situation worsened when the San Antonio disappeared without warning. Tasked with exploring an isolated section, this carrack was carrying a significant portion of the food supplies, as well as several key navigators. In the morning, no sails of this ship were visible on the misty horizon. Magellan, initially incredulous, sent out boats to search the area, but they found no trace. This sudden disappearance seemed suspicious to many, as the crew of the San Antonio included officers whose loyalty to the Captain General was already in question.
I'm calling you because I just listened to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
In reality, the San Antonio turned around and left the strait to return to Spain. Its captain, unbeknownst to Magellan, had decided to head back, perhaps driven by fear of the unknown or by lingering dissensions. Historians debate whether this was an act of outright mutiny or simply a decision for survival. In any case, this defection deprived the fleet of essential cargo, notably biscuits, wine, and navigational instruments. The geopolitical ramifications would only be discovered later, but at the moment, Magellan had to deal with a critical problem: keeping his expedition going. Deprived of a quarter of his fleet, Magellan realized that his expedition was in a precarious situation. Only the Trinidad, the Victoria, and the Concepcion remained to complete the passage through the strait. These three ships now had to share the meager resources available. The sailors, sentenced to reduced rations, still hoped that this passage would soon lead to a real ocean. In this gloomy atmosphere, the Captain General encouraged the crews to unite. The pilots, now reduced in number, assembled with all the maps drawn so far to chart a safe route through the marine labyrinth. The loss of the San Antonio also meant the disappearance of some experienced pilots. In an expedition where each person's expertise was crucial, this shortage risked slowing progress. Magellan, however, had already proven his determination to overcome adversity. At the council on board, he absolutely insisted that everyone continue to follow the same strict discipline: watch shifts, adherence to navigational instructions, and obedience to the chain of command. Tensions between Castilians and Portuguese had been rekindled by this event, but the stakes of the mission required that grudges be silenced, at least temporarily.
I'm calling calling you because I just listened to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Brent.
In the weeks that followed, the Trinidad took the lead of the reduced convoy, tracking the main path of the strait through a tangle of lateral branches. The charts remained incomplete, but each advance confirmed more and more the belief that these waters led somewhere. The exploration remained slow, punctuated by delicate maneuvers to avoid reefs and short stops to assess the depth. The sounders lowered their leads, announced the measurements, while scribes scribbled these figures on damp parchments. Gradually, the channel seemed to widen, promising an open horizon and the continuation of the oceanic adventure. The sailors did not fully realize that they had just crossed a major threshold in maritime history. At this stage, they reasoned only in terms of survival and immediate objectives, getting through the strait, maintaining morale, and avoiding any further mutiny. The climate remained icy, making the sails stiffen with the effect of moisture and biting cold. Each sunrise provided only a few hours of light to maneuver, darkness making any nighttime progress perilous. Officers constantly monitored the sailors' behavior, assessing signs of fatigue or latent opposition. The scarce provisions had to be shared equitably, under penalty of creating jealousy and resentment. When, in November 1520, Ferdinand Magellan's reduced fleet finally emerged from the labyrinth of the strait at the southern tip of the American continent, an unexpected, impressive panorama was revealed to the crew. Before them, the ocean stretched as far as the eye could see, devoid of the violent winds that had so tested the sailors in previous stages. This unknown sea, which they would soon name Pacific due to its apparent tranquility, first presented itself as a vast expanse bathed in dazzling brightness. The striking contrast between the rough waters of the South Atlantic and this new maritime theater gave rise to the idea of a Mar Dulce, as its calm seemed truly unreal. During the first weeks of navigating this new body of water, the crew, still marked by the severity of previous passages, believed they had finally found a respite. The sails billowed under a gentle breeze, which allowed them to save the ropes and limit exhausting maneuvers. The watchmen spent hours gazing at the horizon, seeking the slightest land or change in the wind that might disrupt this tranquility. However, despite this apparent serenity, the crossing westward would reveal unsuspected challenges: the lack of fresh food, the scarcity of drinking water, and the silent threat of scurvy, a formidable disease caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. On board, managing the provisions and water became a priority. The barrels of biscuits and dried peas emptied at the same rate as the days stretched out, and each sailor then received a strictly measured ration. The fresh water, stored in casks exposed to high temperatures in the hold, quickly deteriorated, becoming brackish and sometimes nauseating. The Captain General, from atop the Victoria or the Trinidad, imposed strict discipline to prevent any wastage. The topmen, cabin boys, and officers endured these daily constraints, aware that a single pierced barrel could have dire consequences for the entire expedition. The disease, particularly scurvy, posed a threat. The sailors, forced to eat foods lacking in vitamin C, experienced bleeding gums and loose teeth, declining day by day. The luckiest or best informed among them sometimes chewed pieces of leather or boiled wood shavings, believing they might find in these unlikely materials some salvaging nutrients. Records report the distress of those losing their strength to the point they could no longer climb the mast or hoist the sails. Even if the sea remained gentle, the slow wear of their bodies hinted at a harsh moral test for these men exiled on the vastness of the Mar Dulce. The pilots, meanwhile, refocused on their observation instruments in hopes of locating providential territories. The astrolabe, fragile under these conditions, and the portolans, imprecise in this part of the globe, offered them few guarantees. They relied on the approximate latitude readings, while longitude remained a mystery. The navigators recorded each estimated position in the logbooks, hoping to spot an island where they could land, even briefly, to renew the water and provisions. The days elapsed in oppressive monotony, as the breeze brought no change and the sails seemed motionless under the blinding sun. The first land encountered was an isolated atoll, later identified as Puka Puka in the Tuamotu archipelago, though the crew did not know it at the time. In the distance, the lookout spotted coconut trees and shimmering beaches, seeming to promise comfort. The entire fleet, exhausted from months of sailing, rushed forward, hoping to find fruits, fresh water, and perhaps a friendly welcome from any inhabitants. Upon approach, the coral barrier and lack of a safe anchorage forced the ships to keep a certain distance. The boats sent for reconnaissance faced breaking waves, making access more perilous than expected. A few sailors managed to land on the islet. They discovered light huts made of pandanus, modest water reserves collected in rock crevices, and a few rudimentary fish traps. The islanders, according to the reported testimonies, seemed intrigued but cautious. These first contacts did not lead to real trade, partly due to the language barrier and mutual fear of the unknown. Nevertheless, the Europeans were able to procure some coconuts and a little fresh water, which was enough to revive those most affected by scurvy. Without a secure anchorage, the expedition had to set sail again, carrying with it the hope of soon reaching other, more hospitable lands. During the long journey to the northwest, Magellan and his officers hoped to find larger islands, capable of providing safe shelter and abundant resources. The navigation continued under relatively peaceful conditions, although the accumulated fatigue had dulled the crew's vigilance. The onboard prayers, recited evening and morning, intensified in hopes of provident guidance. The sailors, caught between the fear of perishing at sea and the excitement of discovering fabulous lands, alternated between dejection and exhilaration. The elders still remembered the stories of wondrous lands described by Marco Polo or by Arab merchants, fueling the dreams of the younger sailors. At the beginning of March 1521, the cry of a lookout announced a new land in sight. It was the island of Guam, located in the Mariana Archipelago. As the fleet approached its shores, the natives appeared curious, arriving towards the ships aboard light canoes. They seemed familiar with maritime exchanges, as they offered various items, such as fruits, fresh water, and even some poultry. In return, the sailors presented bells, mirrors, and pieces of cloth. The initial contacts were peaceful, even if mistrust was never far away, with the memory of mutinies and harsh past trials remaining vivid in Magellan's mind. Very quickly, tension rose around the issue of the boats and small canoes, which the Chamorros, inhabitants of Guam, sometimes approached informally, taking what they thought were simple offerings or merchandise to be shared. Cultural misunderstandings added to the exhaustion of the travelers, so much so that an incident soon erupted. Some sailors accused the islanders of theft and reacted by attempting to retrieve their belongings. The inhabitants retaliated with stones and spears. Magellan, mindful of preserving peace but conscious of his duty to protect his crew, ordered an assault to disperse the canoes. The exchanges escalated into a skirmish, leaving behind a few injured on both sides. Despite this clash, the situation did not escalate into open war. On the contrary, a calm settled after several representatives of the island, more curious than hostile, attempted to engage in dialogue with the officers. They seemed intrigued by the variety of European objects and the enormous caravels. The Chamorros sometimes offered fruits or small gifts to show their willingness to negotiate, while the crew, restrained by mistrust, attempted to maintain order on deck. According to accounts, Magellan authorized limited trade, hoping to restore trust and protect his men already weakened by hunger and scurvy. This was indeed a vital issue for the continuation of the journey. The evolution of the situation eventually allowed the Castilians to gather necessary provisions, particularly fresh water, tropical fruits like bananas and papayas, but also some poultry, which provided a source of protein. The navigators entrusted the Chamorros with a handful of knives, glass beads, and other trinkets that seemed to inspire wonder. This resumption of commercial exchanges based on wonder revealed the deep curiosity of the two cultures towards each other. It was an opportunity for the islanders to discover unknown technologies, and for the Europeans, a chance to subsist without resorting to violence. The tensions slightly dissipated, allowing for a salvaging respite after the long wandering in the Pacific. Moreover, this improvised stay on Guam offered the crew an opportunity to heal some physical and moral wounds. The men suffering from scurvy found relative relief thanks to the intake of fresh fruits, rich in vitamins. The encounters allowed for the exchange of some gestures of hospitality and an observation of the daily life of the inhabitants. The officers, on their side, appreciated the importance of local intelligence, sketching the surroundings, noting the location of other islands likely to offer refuge, and controlling general discipline. Magellan, convinced to continue his route to the Great Spice Islands, continuously evaluated the risks and benefits of each stop in the still surprising Pacific. The logbooks suggest that this Guamanian interlude lasted only a few days before the fleet set sail again. It continued its course westward, more determined than ever, buoyed by the renewed energy from the freshly obtained supplies. However, the crew did not forget the difficulties already encountered and understood that other trials inevitably awaited them on this Mar Dulce, unfurling its immensity with a deceptive placidity. The navigation instruments remained too rudimentary to guarantee an error-free trajectory, and the memory of scurvy hovered constantly as a latent threat. On the horizon, the promise of the Spice Islands, rich in spices, fueled the hope of a reward commensurate with the sacrifices made. In early March 1521, Fernão de Magalhães, better known as Magellan, reached the Philippine archipelago with a reduced yet determined fleet. His objectives were twofold: to establish favorable local alliances on behalf of the Castilian crown, and to find a strategic foothold for the expansion of the spice trade. To achieve this, he relied on the experience gained during his long Pacific crossing and the mutual curiosity that developed between his sailors and the island populations they encountered. The key encounter occurred on the island of Cebu, a territory governed by Raja Humabon. Charmed by the hospitality offered by the islanders and the prospect of a fruitful alliance, Magellan quickly initiated diplomatic exchanges. Raja Humabon, intrigued by these foreigners, capable of navigating such distances, saw in this alliance with Castile an opportunity to strengthen his power against other local leaders. The negotiations, supported by gifts from the expedition members, led to a form of mutual pact. In exchange for Hispanic protection and access to European firepower, Humabon agreed to favorably welcome Magellan's delegation in his city. At the heart of this nascent alliance was a religious opportunity that Magellan did not intend to overlook. With Raja Humabon's tacit agreement, he quickly organized mass baptism ceremonies, during which several hundred Cebu inhabitants, including the sovereign himself, received the Christian sacrament. For Magellan, this spiritual success enhanced his prestige with the King of Spain, Charles V, who was always eager to extend the Catholic faith worldwide. Humabon's displayed solidarity also confirmed the validity of the explorer's judgment. By weaving both political and religious ties, he guaranteed valuable local support for his project to establish a Castilian maritime outpost in the region. However, Magellan and his allies' influence was not uniform across the archipelago. On the neighboring island of Mactan, the leader Lapu-Lapu categorically refused any submission, whether political or religious. Mactan had long stood out as a local stronghold of resistance, partly because of its strategic position. The light boats of its warriors could easily move between surrounding islets and launch quick attacks. Cultural links with other communities hostile to Humabon also nourished an embryonic national sentiment. No foreign power should impose itself without a fight. For Lapu-Lapu, Magellan's arrival represented an intrusion that threatened the region's political balance, and he refused the proposals of submission sent from Cebu. Magellan, confident in his military superiority, believed a show of force would be enough to subdue Lapu-Lapu and his supporters. His quickly devised plan aimed to land on Mactan at dawn to surprise the defenders and force them to surrender. However, several crucial elements were overlooked. Firstly, the number of men available for this operation was not as large as Magellan believed, since part of the crew remained occupied in protecting the ships and ensuring logistics on Cebu. Secondly, firearms, while formidable in open terrain, could prove less effective in marshy areas or at low tide, where artillery could not be easily transported. On the morning of April 27, 1521, Magellan and about 60 men advanced on the beach of Mactan. The low tide forced them to cross a long stretch of exposed reefs, making their progress slow and arduous. Lapu-Lapu's warriors, informed of the Spanish approach, set up an ambush, taking advantage of their intimate knowledge of the area. The indigenous bows and spears, wielded skillfully, harassed Magellan's contingent before they could even consolidate their ranks. The numerical gap quickly became evident. The crowd of local defenders, much more numerous, gradually surrounded the Europeans and their Cebu allies.
I'm calling you because I just listened to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too.
Magellan's strategic errors then became fully apparent. His refusal to immediately deploy the cannons, combined with the complexity of the terrain, deprived his group of the technological superiority he had hoped for. Furthermore, he had ordered Raja Humabon and his men not to intervene directly, believing that his own force would suffice to subdue Lapu-Lapu's resistance. This decision had the opposite effect. The warriors of Cebu, witnessing the ferocity of the battle, hesitated to join in for fear of incurring the hostility of Mactan's forces in the event of defeat. Isolated, Magellan's small detachment had to face the repeated assaults of adversaries, determined to defend their land. The confrontation quickly turned to the disadvantage of the Castilian expedition. Magellan, wearing European-style armor, tried to encourage his men by advancing conspicuously on the front lines. But the weight of his armor, made heavier by water and sharp rocks, hindered his mobility. The warriors of Mactan, led by Lapu-Lapu himself, relentlessly exploited this vulnerability. While the muskets struggled to reload, local spears and arrows successively struck Magellan and his soldiers. Soon wounded in the leg and arm, he saw his formation disintegrate, with each soldier trying to save his own life. The accounts describe a brutal clash where the famous explorer ended up surrounded, unable to maintain order among his troops and withstand the tide of determined fighters. According to testimonies collected later, it was during this final assault that Magellan was killed by several blows from spears and sabers. His body, to which many historians attribute a quasi-legendary status, could not be immediately recovered due to the chaos reigning on Mactan's beach. The surviving panicked men scrambled back to the boats in a hurry, leaving behind a dying leader and wounded comrades. This dramatic end of the leader of the expedition marked European chronicles as a tragic and exemplary episode, both the proof that audacity can lead to glory and the cruel illustration of the perils faced by those who underestimate their adversaries. After Magellan's death, the situation among the surviving explorers became extremely tense. First, a sense of betrayal set in. Some Castilian sailors and officers accused Raja Humabon of not intervening, despite the alliance formed. Others saw it rather as a miscalculation by the deceased leader, who wanted to prove his worth to the King of Spain without seeking the help of his indigenous allies. The direct witnesses of the battle also highlighted the heroic nature of the opposition that Lapu-Lapu had organized. While factions argued over responsibilities, one certainty emerged. The expedition had lost its principal guide, the only captain who knew precisely the maritime route traveled so far and the purpose of the ongoing project. For the survivors, the immediate priority was to negotiate a safe exit from Cebu. Relations with Humabon deteriorated as the news of the defeat on Mactan spread, and sources indicate that the Raja, worried about reprisals or a reconfiguration of forces, was no longer willing to maintain the same hospitality as before. In this climate of mistrust, some Castilian officers considered leaving the Philippines as soon as possible, fearing a fate similar to that meted out to Magellan. However, the cargo of spices and the prospect of a glorious return still weighed heavily in the decision-making balance. Before setting sail, it was necessary to reorganize the chain of command, assess the losses in men and material, and consider new routes to rejoin the Iberian Peninsula. The disappearance of Magellan also left a deep psychological void among the sailors. Accustomed to following a charismatic and confident leader, they suddenly found themselves deprived of the captain who had guided them through countless difficulties, mutinies, storms, hunger, and diseases. Even those who had previously questioned his authority now felt a sense of vulnerability. This uncertainty was expressed through internal quarrels, with later witnesses reporting that they could escalate into barely veiled threats. The feeling of needing to properly honor Magellan's memory was mixed with the necessity of surviving in an environment that had become hostile. Some sailors even proposed avenging their captain's death by organizing a punitive expedition against the inhabitants of Mactan. But this unrealistic project was dismissed by the senior officers, who realized prudence now outweighed bravery. The immediate consequences of the captain's disappearance went beyond the mere question of leadership. They also affected the diplomatic representation of the expedition. Magellan was the main interlocutor with the monarchs and local chiefs, and his ability to negotiate despite his fatal overconfidence at Mactan remained a major asset. Without him, and facing the growing skepticism from Humabon, the group's cohesion was severely tested. The remaining officers now had to determine who would take on the role of negotiating or communicating with the archipelago's leaders. Several personalities emerged, but each carried its own vision, sometimes far removed from Magellan's, regarding the route to follow and the level of cooperation desired with the natives. This cacophony weakened the expedition at a crucial moment, as the continuation of the journey depended more than ever on stable relations with the insular rulers. In May 1521, shortly after Fernão de Magalhães' disappearance in the Philippines, The expedition sponsored by the Crown of Castile found itself in a uniquely precarious situation, now commanded by the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano. The reduced fleet continued its journey to the Moluccas Islands, located in the region known today as the Spice Archipelago, east of the Insulin. The sailors still under the Castilian flag were tasked with reaching Tidore, one of the most coveted islands due to its abundance of cloves. Their goal was based on a subtle mix of diplomacy, audacity, and calculation to negotiate a cargo of spices with high market value. The road to the Moluccas was not without danger. Besides the threat from rival powers like the Portuguese, established in several outposts in the region, each advance at sea could meet with hostility from uncertain local populations or inter-island conflicts. The sailors for whom Elcano was now responsible were also aware that the crew was reduced by the loss of many senior officers. Some perished in battle, others were abandoned after the Puerto San Julian mutiny, not to mention the losses suffered during the Santiago shipwreck off the Patagonian coast. Over the weeks, the thirst for gold and spices heightened the tension. The arrival at Tidore in November 1521 marked a crucial step, as it was the first time the expedition could negotiate in relatively safe territory since the tragic events in Cebu. The local leaders, hostile to the Portuguese, cautiously welcomed the Castilians. Elcano's emissaries offered gifts to gain the favor of the Sultan of Tidore, determined to strengthen his independence from Ternate, the neighboring island. The sailors hoped to stock up on cloves, a highly prized commodity on the European market. The negotiations led to a mutually beneficial trade agreement, allowing the flotilla to seize a significant cargo to fill the already damaged holds of the two surviving ships. This transaction finally offered a prospect of profitability, but the question of returning home remained challenging. With only 3 ships departing from the Philippines and the recent loss of the Concepcion, deemed superfluous due to the lack of men, only the Victoria and the Trinidad were left to continue the adventure. The sailors, exhausted from wandering at sea and decimated by battles, could no longer manage the simultaneous navigation of 3 boats. As a result, Elcano and his officers made the irreversible decision to set the Concepcion ablaze, preferring to keep the crew concentrated on 2 better-equipped units to traverse uncharted waters. At the time of this arson, the seriousness of the military and health context was becoming clearer day by day. Since the death of Magalhães, mutual distrust tainted internal relations. Some Portuguese officers, who remained in the Castilian camp despite the rivalries between the Iberian crowns, doubted Elcano's competence and quietly questioned his authority. The youngest sailors, for their part, feared navigating through a notoriously difficult Indian Ocean, dotted with ports where local populations could prove hostile. The memories of Malacca, conquered by the Portuguese in 1511, still haunted those who had witnessed the battles in this maritime citadel. Despite these uncertainties, the need to bring the precious cargo back to Europe prevailed. While the Trinidad still required significant repairs, Elcano opted for a division of tasks. The Victoria would attempt to reach the Indian Ocean without delay, while the heavier and damaged Trinidad would seek an alternative route before setting sail again. The cartographic knowledge the sailors possessed was limited, and no one knew for sure which route would best avoid the well-established Portuguese outposts on the African coast. The 2 crews, now rivals in the race for success, were urged to do everything possible to survive. The Victoria, effectively commanded by Elcano, headed south and faced the first difficulties near the small islands of the Insulinda. Each stop, no matter how brief, served to replenish fresh water and trade some valuable items for provisions. The inhabitants of these territories, intrigued by the cosmopolitan crew, sometimes asked for explanations about the origin of these light-skinned navigators, armed with cannons and arquebuses unknown in the region. Elcano, who spoke some Portuguese and a bit of Malay learned from more experienced sailors, attempted to negotiate fair prices, preferring to avoid any resort to violence. Crossing the Strait of Malacca, strategic in Asian maritime trade, required extreme caution. Although the Portuguese exerted growing influence there, the Victoria managed to bypass some checkpoints by navigating close to the coast and favoring discretion. The memory of the capture of Malacca by Afonso de Albuquerque 10 years earlier prompted Elcano to be vigilant, as any incident with the Portuguese garrisons could definitively compromise the journey. Accounts from sailors who had passed through these routes explained the importance of currents, formidable at certain times of the year, and the need to watch for abrupt changes in wind. Once the strait was crossed, the Victoria set course westward. The area was frequented by many Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants who controlled a significant portion of the regional trade. Offers of supplies were sometimes costly for travelers with not much trading stock. Provisions began to diminish worryingly, and Elcano ordered strict rationing to prevent epidemics and total shortages. The sailors, already tested, suffered from the heat and humidity, while fearing a potential hostile encounter with a fleet that would refuse the Victoria any peaceful transit. As they progressed toward the Indian Ocean proper, the crew had to manage the danger of the monsoon, this periodic wind system capable of bringing violent storms and disrupting navigation. The rare maps available, sometimes sketched on simple parchments, neglected the detailed geography of unknown coasts. Elcano and his crew then relied on reading the stars, landmarks provided by accounts of Arab pilots, and the behavior of seabirds to determine the direction to follow. The compasses, inherited from the Chinese techno-scientific legacy and improved by Europeans, did not always compensate for the lack of reliable information. As it reached the open sea, the Victoria endured a succession of violent storms that severely tested its hull and sails. The sailors, accustomed to the hardships of the Atlantic and the Pacific, discovered here a climate even more unpredictable, punctuated by blinding lightning and swirling winds. The pumps worked day and night to drain the water seeping into the hold, while emergency caulking accumulated to seal the cracks. On some days, torrential rain allowed them to collect drinking water, which was a relief given the scarcity of resources. The men prayed, terrified at the thought of never seeing Europe again.
I'm calling you because I just listened to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too.
Hunger, too, began to take its toll. The biscuit supplies, damaged by humidity, became moldy, and the little salted meat that remained turned rancid. To stave off weakness, some chewed on leather soaked in seawater, while others preferred to seek out all kinds of seaweed in the hope of finding nutrients. Scurvy, fueled by the lack of fresh fruit, was spreading insidiously. Gums started bleeding, teeth fell out, and extreme fatigue pinned the men to the deck. Elcano, aware of this scourge, tried to encourage everyone to drink as much fresh water as possible and to ventilate the holds to delay rotting. Progress remained perilous across the Indian Ocean, known for its high waves and unpredictable storms. Elcano, along with his pilots, sought to avoid areas they thought were monitored by the Portuguese. Islands such as Madagascar, where the Portuguese already had stopovers, posed risks of confrontation. The Victoria sometimes skirted coasts over long distances, taking advantage of occasional anchorages to replenish water and, with a bit of luck, obtain some food supplies. Brief contacts with local inhabitants, often wary, did not dispel the constant fear of being spotted. The crew was fully aware that the slightest skirmish could turn into a disaster. The decision to bypass the Cape of Good Hope, already known for its violent gusts and treacherous currents, was made despite the persistent fatigue. From the voyages of Bartolomeo Diaz at the end of the 15th century, accounts describe this passage as particularly grueling, as the meeting of the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean gave rise to powerful whirlpools. The rigging of the Victoria, worn and poorly maintained, sometimes held by a thread in these conditions. The men shivered during the cooler nights, too weakened to properly repair everything that tore. The waves, higher than the gunwale, occasionally submerged the deck, sometimes sweeping away whatever was not securely fastened. As the Cape of Good Hope approached, fear turned into a mix of resignation and determination not to fail so close to the goal. By July 1522, wear and disease still plagued the crew, but the Victoria managed to press on, driven by the hope of an invaluable reward once returned to Castile. The shadow of scurvy, the torn sails, and the constant fear of shipwreck could not deter the stubborn progress. Everyone drew on their courage. On September 6, 1522, a sky still veiled by dawn revealed the laborious arrival of a faltering ship in the Bay of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. On the deck, 18 exhausted men wandered, emaciated and clad in rags, unable to hide the scars of several months of deprivation. They had just completed the final leg of a journey that began 3 years earlier, when a fleet of 5 caravels, under the command of Fernão de Magalhães, had left Seville with the ambition to reach the Spice Islands by the west. Only the Victoria, disfigured by damage, returned victorious but heavily bereaved. The Victoria, originally launched as a modest support ship, now remained the symbol of an expedition that had revolutionized the geographical perception of the world. On board, there were nearly 3,000 pounds, or about 26 tons, of precious spices, mainly cloves, known for their high commercial value in Europe. This treasure, carefully stored in the hold since it was loaded in the Moluccas, promised colossal profits for the Castilian crown. Yet, as the ship reached the quay, spectators witnessing the maneuver could easily make out the emaciated faces and extreme fatigue of the surviving crew. The man who now commanded the Victoria was named Juan Sebastian Elcano, an experienced Basque sailor who had taken charge of the expedition after the tragic death of Magellan in the Philippines and the succession of perils that followed. Confronted with mutinies, food shortages, and the desertion of one of the ships in search of a passage to the west, Elcano managed to maintain a semblance of discipline until the completion of the return voyage across the Indian Ocean. This crossing, notorious for its contrary winds and numerous lurking dangers, severely tested the resilience of the crew, already weakened by months of wandering. As the news of the Victoria's arrival spread, the local population gathered on the shores. Many remembered the grand departure organized in 1519, a procession of flamboyant ships, fanfares, promises of unprecedented exploits. The contrast on September 6, 1522, was striking. The sole surviving ship tended to illustrate human fragility in the face of the ocean's vastness, while highlighting the resounding achievement these sailors now bore witness to. The eagerness of the curious was driven by the desire to see, to understand, and perhaps to learn a lesson from this odyssey that seemed almost inconceivable to them. As Elcano stepped ashore, supported by two sailors too weak to walk on their own, a representative of the royal administration stepped forward to receive an initial report. It was necessary to officially record the details of the voyage, prepare a comprehensive inventory of the cargo, and notify the court of Charles V, a monarch who was both the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. In a state of evident fatigue, Elcano briefly recounted the final stages of the journey: the long route from the Moluccas, the difficult passage off the east coast of Africa, and then the flight across the Atlantic to avoid Portuguese patrols hostile to Castilian success. The financial outcome at first glance seemed very promising. The load of spices, particularly the famed cloves, was worth more than all the expenses incurred at the start of the enterprise. Although the expedition had lost 4 ships and hundreds of men, the sale of this precious commodity made it possible to offset expenses and consider a substantial profit. According to preliminary estimates, the mere assortment of cloves, a medicinal cure-all and luxury perfumer, would be enough to ignite fierce competition in European markets. However, it was still necessary to transport this precious lot to official warehouses, inventory each sack, and negotiate royal taxes. The reception reserved for Elcano, despite the evident success, was tinged with a certain reserve. Unlike the celebration one might expect for a unique feat, the court of Castile, already shaken by the War of the Communities and other internal tensions, was not wholly focused on maritime conquests. Some courtiers were jealous of the fame that Magellan's former subordinate might acquire. Furthermore, Magellan's death, a controversial hero, left a symbolic void. He was criticized for his Portuguese origin, yet his genius in navigation was praised. Divergent opinions fostered a mixed sentiment among the dignitaries. When Elcano and the surviving sailors were finally summoned to Valladolid, the city where Charles V often held his court, they testified to the ordeals faced before the royal advisors. The King-Emperor, who saw in these results the possibility of strengthening his geopolitical position, showed interest in every detail that might consolidate Castilian claims on the Moluccas. Elcano, well aware of the political weight of this information, emphasized the importance of securing the western route to avoid direct confrontations with the Portuguese, seasoned conquerors of the Cape of Good Hope route. He also highlighted the vulnerability of the installations in the Philippines, still underdeveloped. Elcano was knighted by the king and received an annual pension for his service, while a coat of arms was commissioned depicting a globe topped with a motto glorifying the first circumnavigation, Primus circumdedisti me, you have encircled me first. This distinction, although prestigious, concealed the political recovery operated by Charles V, determined to demonstrate the maritime superiority of his crown. In the eyes of the Iberian powers, the question of the limits imposed by the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, remained a major issue. The actual discovery of a route to the richest spice islands stoked rivalries with Portugal. Beyond the apparent pomp, collective memory could not obscure the immense sacrifices made. Bereaved families, left without news of their loved ones, who had departed in 1519, demanded explanations about the circumstances of the disappearance of so many souls. The rare testimonies, often incomplete, reported diseases, shipwrecks, battles against local populations, and also mutinies that had turned into carnage. Among the missing was Magellan himself, who fell at Mactan in the Philippine archipelago, after underestimating the fierce resistance of Lapu-Lapu and his warriors. The official accounts, already somewhat romanticized, sometimes omitted the darkest details to emphasize accomplished heroism. Merchants studying the commercial potential of this precious cargo observed with curiosity the overall success of the operation. It would have been easy to imagine a triumphant epic, but the accounts contrasted with the reality of an almost annihilated fleet. Today's historians estimate that if the value of the spices brought back far exceeded the initial investment, the true significance of the venture lay elsewhere in the empirical confirmation of the Earth's roundness, already advanced by ancient geographers, but rarely verified on a comparable scale, as well as a redrawing of the world map, now expanded to the Pacific Ocean and its countless islands. In this in-between, where recognition and questioning mingled, some chroniclers of the time began to allude to new territories located south of the American continent. Since the passage of the strait named by Magellan, hypotheses emerged suggesting that there might exist a massive land even further south, potentially colossal, which no one had explored in detail. Rumors suggested it could even extend very far and hold unknown riches. This vague concept, which would later circulate under the name Terra Australis, was already fueling speculation. Despite the lack of precise cartography, these assumptions suggested that the oceanic adventure was only in its early hours. In Sanlúcar, where the journey had just ended, notarial chronicles recorded every scrap of information gleaned from the 18 survivors. The Castilian navy sought elements likely to prepare other expeditions, improve ships, or adjust itineraries. Local representatives, mandated by the Casa de Contratación, wanted to understand every difficulty encountered to better estimate future operations. Traders, on their part, assessed the relevance of new partnerships, aware of having in front of them an opportunity to dominate the spice market. The accounts of constraints imposed by the Portuguese encouraged the Spanish monarchy toward a cautious development of this trans-Pacific route, still poorly understood, demanding and extremely perilous. In intellectual circles, the idea of a terra incognita to the south of the globe animated debates. The rare maps compiled after the circumnavigation showed a vast hypothetical continent, sometimes called Terra Australis Incognita, intended to balance the landmass of the northern hemisphere according to an old theory dating back to antiquity. Although no expedition had yet undertaken to explore its confines, the feat of the Victoria's crew demonstrated that there were still immense spaces to discover. The chronicles reporting the return of Elcano and his companions nourished new dreams of expansion, inviting the Crown of Castile to scrutinize far beyond the Moluccas towards other unexplored horizons. Some were already talking about a global empire beyond imagination. The circumnavigation, belatedly completed in September 1522, produced a shock effect in the European world and beyond. Until then, despite the theoretical knowledge from antiquity, in particular thanks to the calculations of Eratosthenes and the theories of Ptolemy, the roundness of the Earth had never been demonstrated so concretely. The sailors, who returned to Sanlúcar de Barrameda aboard the Victoria after 3 years of trials, embodied the living proof that the ocean was no longer an insurmountable barrier and that the globe could be circumnavigated by sea. From a geopolitical standpoint, this success immediately plunged the Iberian powers, Castile embodied by the Spanish monarchy, and Portugal into a phase of intense discussions. Indeed, the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, divided the world according to a meridian located 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. However, this line of demarcation suddenly proved insufficient to precisely determine the rights of each crown at the other end of the planet, particularly in the region of the Spice Islands, rich in spices. The confirmation of the Earth's sphericity did not constitute a revelation in scholarly circles, as the Church and many European scholars already accepted this principle. However, never before had anyone been able to certify the size, distance, and especially the feasibility of a complete tour by sea. The travel notes, makeshift maps sketched during navigation, and logbooks provided by the surviving officers offered new concrete elements to refine the measurement of the globe. They also revealed the labyrinthine complexity of the Pacific waters and the difficulty of crossing such a vast ocean. The navigators highlighted the length of the journey, the scarcity of stopovers, and the need for larger and better equipped transports if one wished to establish a regular route to the spices of Asia. This discovery modified the calculations of cosmological schools established in Europe and helped reposition humanity in a revisited geography, now less speculative and more supported by tangible evidence. The question of the scale of the globe became crucial for the kings of Spain and Portugal. The actual distances, more extensive than expected, indicated that the limits set by Tordesillas were not practical for dividing zones of influence in the distant Pacific. The major issue concentrated on the sovereignty of the Moluccas, located halfway between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, thus at the crossroads of the two Iberian colonial dynamics. It was in this context that several diplomatic meetings were held, including the Badajoz-Elvas Conference between 1524 and 1529. The two crowns sent their best cartographers, cosmographers, and jurists to negotiate a new line. The debates were fueled by the stories of the Victoria sailors, as well as the data collected on the exact position of the islands producing cloves and nutmeg. During these discussions, terrestrial globes and portulans were used to accurately determine the longitude of the Moluccas in relation to the theoretical Tordesillas line. The Portuguese claimed that these islands were within their sphere of influence, while the Spaniards contested these arguments by presenting their own maps. Methodological differences in calculating longitude, still in their infancy at the time, made reaching an agreement difficult. Reliable marine clocks did not exist, and the position of a point on the globe was primarily attempted through star observation. The result was a set of approximations subject to heated controversies. Finally, after numerous disagreements, a compromise was reached in 1529 with the Treaty of Zaragoza, also called the Treaty of Saragossa, or Capitulation of Zaragoza, which endorsed the principle of a Portuguese purchase of Castilian rights to the Moluccas. The negotiated sums were considerable, reflecting the immense strategic importance of these islands in the globalized economy of the time. This renegotiation highlighted how Magellan's voyages, or rather the expedition he initially led, revolutionized the understanding of maps. Previously established documents, like the world maps inspired by Ptolemy, were revised in light of discoveries made in the South Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Asian archipelago. Attempts to create a complete representation of the globe also benefited from the rise of cartographic workshops. A few decades later, the Flemish geographer Gerardus Mercator, 1512-1594, would develop a revolutionary projection, now known as the Mercator projection, which facilitated straight-line navigation based on the concept of loxodromes. His contemporary Abraham Ortelius, 1527, would publish one of the first modern atlases, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, 1570, compiling updated maps of every region of the world. Even though these figures emerged a bit after 1529, they inherited the advances made possible by circumnavigation and reinforced the idea of a unified representation of the planet. In parallel, the Spanish monarchy established an official register to synthesize the geographic and maritime information gathered during explorations, the Padrón Real. This tool, controlled by the Casa de la Contratación of Seville, aimed to produce a unique reference map, regularly updated as pilots and captains arrived. Testimonials about the fauna, flora, and peoples encountered were also archived to enrich naturalistic and ethnographic knowledge. The idea was to consolidate an information monopoly to preserve navigation secrets against potential competitors. Beyond Iberian rivalries, this cartographic quest then extended to England and France, where Italian or Basque navigators were commissioned to try to discover new maritime routes. In the eyes of the European public, the Earth now had more concrete contours, though often on maps that were approximate, riddled with imaginary islands or errors of proportions due to the difficulty of estimating longitudes. In this movement of reconfiguring the world, the concept of circumnavigation was established as both a technical and mental feat. The idea that a ship could sail around the globe and return to its home port opened new perspectives on human mobility. It illustrated the growing power of sail navigation, supported by progress in astronomy, shipbuilding, and logistical organization. More deeply, it offered a heroic narrative to the European Renaissance, eager for stories of adventure and discovery. The perception of the ocean changed, no longer a simple barrier to cross. It became a vast space of circulation, potentially unifying, but also a source of multiple risks. The universality of the maritime world began to assert itself, connecting continents that, a few decades earlier, seemed to belong to almost autonomous spheres of existence. Circumnavigation was also a triumph on the intellectual level. True, the appreciation of the Earth's roundness existed since antiquity, but this expedition undeniably proved that the sea did not end, that there were no insurmountable walls beyond a certain point. At the same time, cartographers became aware that the distance between Europe and Asia via the west exceeded what many Europeans imagined. Columbus, at the end of the 15th century, had bet on a shorter crossing. However, the sailors of the Victoria demonstrated that the dimensions of the Pacific far exceeded the initial estimates. This realization moderated the overly optimistic dream of an easy passage to the wealthy Asian markets of silk garments and fragrant spices. However, this historic moment also produced myths. In popular belief, it is often reported that Fernão de Magalhães, better known in Hispanic sources as Magellan, was the first man to complete a full circle of the globe. Yet, Magellan died in April 1521 in the Philippine archipelago during the Battle of Mactan against the forces of Lapu-Lapu. He therefore did not experience the return to Spain. The true achievement of a complete loop belongs to a small group of survivors led by the Basque Juan Sebastián Elcano. He and his companions were the first to complete the circle in September 1522, providing direct testimony on the great distance traveled and the complexity of the adventure. Historians point out that some members of the crew of Malaysian origin might have potentially completed a full circle if they had already visited Europe before returning to the islands of Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, in European iconography, it is indeed Elcano who was officially designated as the first circumnavigator, honored by Charles V, even though this recognition was tempered by the desire to preserve the memory of Magellan, the initiator of the project. The myth was also fueled by a state-driven desire to magnify the Lusitano-Castilian role in these great expeditions, sometimes at the expense of crews of many nationalities. Official chroniclers, dependent on the crown, favored the figure of a unique commander, bearer of an almost prophetic mission. Magellan embodied this ambivalent Portuguese hero, putting himself in the service of Castile to accomplish what his own sovereigns had refused to fund. As a result, his name was elevated to the rank of a symbol of perseverance and determination, despite his premature death prior to the final success of the circumnavigation. This memorial construction did not completely erase Elcano's contribution, but it did place him in the background, emphasizing more his quality as a courageous executor than his possible role as a strategist in the crucial decision to complete the journey. Subsequently, the evocation of the First World Tour continued to oscillate between the glory of the deceased captain and the reality of those who truly returned to Spanish soil. On the scientific level, the success of this world tour inspired new vocations among astronomers and cartographers from Central and Northern Europe. The desire to explore beyond the boundaries of the Mediterranean motivated scholars like the Nuremberger Johannes Scheiner, a globe-making specialist, and Gemma Frisius, a Dutch mathematician who perfected measurement techniques. All drew inspiration from the experience accumulated by the Castilian and Portuguese navigators, seeking to solve the enigma of longitude and represent more faithfully the contours of the planet. For the first time, a complete planetary system began to be envisaged, where each country would have its place on a coherent map, even though the shores of Australia, Antarctica, and part of North America remained largely unknown. The project to establish a unified geography gained influence, fueled both by the thirst for commercial conquest and by the purely scholarly interest in the knowledge of the vast world. Between 1522 and 1529, the direct consequences of the expedition around the globe also took the form of exacerbated rivalries. The Portuguese, who had bet on circumventing Africa and dominating the Indian Ocean, feared losing their lucrative monopoly on the spice trade if Castile managed to sustainably exploit the Pacific route. The Portuguese crown attempted to strengthen its positions in Goa, Malacca, and other Asian trading posts, while concluding diplomatic arrangements with local sultans to maintain the exclusivity of transactions. On the Castilian side, there was hope to demonstrate that the Pacific route offered a more direct access to the Moluccas without passing through the Portuguese network. There was also the prospect of conquering new American territories not yet claimed by Lisbon. The debate on the exact position of the Tordesillas line in the Pacific Ocean thus led to endless discussions. These disputes were partially settled by the Agreement of 1529, which, for a compensation of 350,000 ducats, according to some sources, ultimately granted the Portuguese sovereignty over these precious Clove Islands. In the aftermath, Spain's attention shifted to other objectives, consolidating its nascent empire in the New World, conquered by Hernán Cortés in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru, organizing the exploitation of Andean silver, exploring the coasts of Florida, or even promoting expansion toward the Isthmus of Panama. The Pacific Ocean remained crucial for access to the Asian market, but the profitability of a regular route remained to be proven due to the distances and supply difficulties. Nevertheless, this first circumnavigation had given birth to a vision of a fully navigable world, provided one had robust ships, experienced crews, and the necessary logistics to face storms, scurvy, and the possibility of mutinies.
I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
Cartographic creations multiplied, fueled by curiosity and the necessity to control distant spaces. The scrupulous study of the southern hemisphere latitudes, the updating of American coasts, and the exploration of Pacific archipelagos contributed to the retreat of so-called unknown zones. Later navigators, such as André de San Martin or Andrés de Urdaneta, continued the task by seeking more direct return routes, like the route of the Manila Galleon between the Philippines and Mexico. Progress in determining latitude was clear, but the calculation of longitude remained imprecise, stimulating the search for more refined instruments such as calibrated hourglasses, portable sundials, and later, pendulum clocks adapted for sea voyages. Throughout Europe, scholarly circles debated the distribution of land and seas, questioning the possible existence of a gigantic southern continent intended to balance the globe. Ptolemy, in antiquity, had already speculated about a terra australis incognita. The circumnavigation of 1522 neither disproved nor directly confirmed it, leaving the door open to new hypotheses. The exploration of South America by the Portuguese and the Spanish, along with the crossing of the Pacific, maintained the idea that there were still immense spaces to discover. The presence of an unknown continent in the south was imagined, possibly harboring further riches. Gabriel de Castilla, later, claimed to have reached the shores of the Antarctic continent, fueling the belief that there might still be a vast territory to exploit. Maps produced after 1522 sometimes showed incomplete silhouettes of a mysterious southern continent, posing more questions than they provided definitive answers. The official recognitions in the decade following 1522 primarily benefited Elcano and a few of his surviving companions. Charles V granted them pensions, honorary titles, and symbolically, a sphere topped with a cross, accompanied by the Latin motto, Primus circumdedisti me, meaning, the first who circumnavigated me. This gesture undeniably recognized the achievement of the Basque sailor, while offering an imperial validation of the foundational act that was the discovery of an uninterrupted maritime path around the globe. Despite everything, public renown remained attached to the name of Magellan alone, due to his initial role as expedition leader, tactical innovator, and diplomatic intermediary. Subsequent accounts, often written by authors removed from the concrete details, consolidated this narrative, relegating Elcano to the role of a loyal second, even though he assumed the command in the final stage. Symbolically, Magellan's volatile destiny, having moved from the service of Portugal to that of Castile, embodied the permeability of the political boundaries of the time for individuals eager to pursue bold projects. Monarchs bet on talents, regardless of national origin, as long as the enterprise benefited the royal treasury. Portuguese opinion saw Magalhães as a traitor, while Castilian propaganda extolled the cosmopolitan genius of the man who had managed to overcome the South Atlantic obstacle. Subsequently, Elcano, a native of Guitaria in Biscay, personified Basque naval competence, a long-standing expertise thanks to the practice of deep-sea fishing and whaling. These origins reflected the cultural diversity of the crew and the very spirit of great discoveries where Italians, Flemings, Portuguese, Germans, and Africans mingled. The scientific scope of the expedition far exceeded matters of national prestige. The systematic study of new territories, the collection of information on fauna and flora, the observation of celestial phenomena in the southern hemisphere, all these data fueled the theological, philosophical, and naturalist reflection of the Renaissance. The disputes over the ownership of spices and precious metals reflected a more prosaic reality, without stifling the scholarly enthusiasm at work in European universities. Libraries like the Escurial in Spain or the Biblioteca Regia in Lisbon began to gather volumes, manuscripts, and atlases detailing various maritime routes. This intellectual treasure gave birth to a lasting legacy, completed in the following decades by great figures of cartography.